The image of the gladiator is one of fierce warriors locked in mortal combat, battling to the death for the entertainment of the Roman crowd. It's a dramatic picture that has captured imaginations for centuries. Swords clashing, blood spilled, and lives lost in the sand of the arena. But this popular vision, fueled by movies and stories, only tells part of the story. The truth about gladiatorial combat is far more complex. Gladiators were not simply disposable fighters sent to die for spectacle. In fact, many bouts ended without death, and the lives of these men were shaped by a web of economics, politics, rules, and strategy. In this series, we'll explore the real world behind the myth, from the backgrounds of gladiators, their grueling training, the careful management of their careers, to the political uses of the games, and the surprising ways mercy and brotherhood influenced the arena. You'll discover how the fights were crafted as entertainment, how survival was often the goal, and why the crowd's voice could mean the difference between life and death. Step beyond the myths and witness the fascinating reality of the gladiator games, where death was a possibility, but not always the outcome. The roar of the crowd in a Roman amphitheater was deafening, a chorus of excitement and bloodlust that shook the very stones of the arena. But long before the sand was stained with sweat and steel, long before the trumpet's blast signaled the start of a fight, the empire thrived on conquest, and conquest brought with it a steady stream of prisoners. These men Gauls, Thracians, Numidians, Britons were paraded through Roman streets in chains after military victories, living trophies of Rome's power. One of the most brutal was the category of Nazi-condemned criminals, debtors, or slaves who had disobeyed their masters. In a world where citizenship was a prized status and dignity was sacred, this choice might seem baffling. Why would a Roman citizen give up freedom to live under the yoke of the arena? For these unfortunate souls, the arena was not a career but a sentence. They were often poorly trained, if trained at all, and were used in the bloodier, more fatal exhibitions, the kinds of matches where the outcome was a foregone conclusion. A man who had fallen on hard times, whether through gambling, failed ventures, or misfortune, might see the arena as a means of escape. Here, under the watchful eye of the lanista, they were drilled not just in combat, but in discipline, endurance, and performance. But in this crucible, men were forged into fighters. Bonds were formed between them, camaraderie born of shared suffering, a brotherhood even among rivals. Within the walls of the ludus, they were fed and clothed, their health maintained with surprising care. Injured fighters were treated by doctors, and their physical fitness was paramount. In a society where many poor citizens lived in squalor, the gladiator, ironically, was often better nourished. He was, after all, an investment. Even the philosophical Stoics admired the gladiator's discipline, his ability to meet fate with calm and honor. These were not mindless killers, nor were they passive victims. They were men caught in the machinery of empire, navigating a world where violence could mean survival, and survival could mean honor. By conquest, by punishment, by desperation, by the strange seduction of fame. Their reasons were many, but their fate was shared. And in the red dust of the Colosseum, under the gaze of thousands, they fought not just for Rome, but for themselves, for meaning, and for a future beyond the blade. They came from farms, villages, battlefields, cities, and prisons. They were warriors, criminals, sons, fathers, and slaves. And each, in his own way, had been born again in the arena. Seneca, the Roman philosopher, often used gladiators as metaphors for inner strength and resilience. The forced marches, the signed contracts, the farewells whispered behind prison doors, the names they left behind, and the roles they assumed. In this strange fusion of brutality and dignity, the gladiator became a symbol of both human suffering and human triumph. Within the ludus, a strange sense of family emerged. These men had no one else. Their old lives were gone. What remained was the arena and each other. Their identities were reshaped. Many were given stage names based on their weaponry or origin. The Murmillo, with his heavy shield, some were born into it, children of slaves who were raised for the games, their destinies written before they could speak. Others found themselves there by a twist of fate, a lost battle, an unjust accusation, a failed crop. They could be awarded a rudis, a wooden sword symbolizing freedom, if they impressed the crowd and the editor of the games. Some won their release and went on to become trainers, bodyguards, or even celebrities. The crowd loved a good story, and a gladiator who survived multiple battles became a legend. The reasons varied, but the result was the same: a life of violence, spectacle, and uncertain endings. Wounds accumulated. Careers ended with a single misstep. The roar of the crowd, once thrilling, could quickly turn to condemnation. In this world, you were only as good as your last fight. And fish-shaped helmet, the Threx modeled after Thracian warriors, the Retiarius who fought with net and trident, evoking fishermen of the sea. By signing a contract with the Lanista, he received lodging, food, and the promise of regular pay. The price? His autonomy, his name, and possibly his life. These men willingly entered the gladiator school, where they trained alongside slaves and criminals. Some even thrived, rising through the ranks to become crowd favorites, admired for their bravery and skill. They might be forced to fight wild beasts, chained and without hope, or pitted against seasoned fighters as a form of public execution. In a culture obsessed with martial valor, the gladiator was both feared and revered. Emperor Commodus famously fought as a gladiator, scandalizing the Senate but thrilling the crowds. His participation, though carefully staged and heavily guarded, blurred the lines between ruler and entertainer, nobility and brute. Some citizens, particularly from lower classes, longed for glory that traditional paths could not provide. In the arena, a man could earn fame, money, and even the adoration of the masses. He could etch his name into legend if he survived. The imperial period saw more than a few men, including disgraced soldiers or outcasts, step into the sands in search of redemption. These deaths were meant as warnings, deterrents in flesh and blood. Those who were strong, defiant, or particularly warlike often found themselves sold into the gladiator schools. Here, their skills in battle could be redirected toward entertainment. Stripped of identity and freedom, they were renamed, retrained, and refashioned into tools of spectacle. There was a quieter, crueler path, a path that led men from every corner of the empire to the gates of the gladiatorial schools. Gladiators, to many modern minds, were mere slaves forced to fight for the amusement of others. But the reality was far more complex. These men came from varied backgrounds. Some were captives of war, some were condemned criminals, and some, astonishingly, were volunteers who stepped willingly into the arena. Each had a story, and each had a reason for walking that road. At the core of Rome's gladiatorial system was slavery. Some of these enslaved men had once been proud warriors. Imagine a Celtic chieftain, dragged from his homeland after resisting Roman occupation, his arms still bearing the scars of tribal warfare. Or a Germanic scout, known for his speed and cunning, now reduced to a name on a roster. For them, the arena offered one last chance to wield their strength with purpose, however grim that purpose might be. In this way, combat became not just survival, but a remnant of who they once were. But not all gladiators were prisoners of war. Rome had other pipelines to the arena. Yet the most surprising figures on the sand were not slaves at all, but octorati-free men who volunteered to become gladiators. The answer, as so often in history, lay in desperation and ambition. For many, debt was the gateway. There were also those driven not by poverty, but by pride. Even aristocrats, intoxicated by the allure of spectacle and status, occasionally donned armor and fought in public games, though these events were highly controversial. For all these men slave or volunteer, The journey into gladiatorial life began at the Ludus, the training school. Training was brutal. The food was high-calorie but monotonous, designed to build muscle and stamina. Injuries were frequent. Punishments were harsh. The path to the arena was not a straight one. And yet, the life of a gladiator was not without its strange privileges. Beyond the school, the arena offered opportunity. Victorious gladiators earned prizes, money, and public acclaim. But for every man who triumphed, many fell. The life expectancy of a gladiator was short, even if not every fight ended in death. Still, the image of the gladiator endured. To the Romans, he embodied courage, endurance, and control in the face of death. What's most striking is how layered their world truly was. When we imagine them now standing in the blinding sun, facing an opponent, hearing the crowd scream, we must also imagine the long journey behind them. Born to the arena, yes, but not by choice alone. Before the cheers of the crowd, before the clash of blades under the Roman sun, came the grind of preparation. Hidden from the spectacle of the arena was a world no less intense, a world of sweat, blood, order, and routine. The Ludus, or gladiator training school, was both prison and proving ground. It was here that men enslaved or free, broken or eager, were transformed into gladiators. And it was here that the real survival began. To outsiders, the Ludus was a place of brute force, where men were beaten into killers. But within its walls, a different story unfolded. The Ludus was also a system, a calculated, methodical machine designed to produce not just violence, but performance. Under the harsh sun or in winter's chill, the men drilled tirelessly. Every movement was scrutinized. Every step, every swing, every block had to be perfect. Gladiators sparred with wooden swords, called rudis, and wore protective gear to avoid serious injury. Some drills mimicked combat, others built stamina, then muscle. They practiced footwork, endlessly circling, advancing, retreating. They learned how to fall, how to rise, how to read an opponent's body. They shared pain, food, stories, silence. They knew the cost of the life they were preparing others for. Some were cruel, others were quietly compassionate. They corrected mistakes with barked commands, but sometimes a word of encouragement would slip through. A nod, a hand on the shoulder, a moment of shared understanding. The constant presence of death made every day sharp and real. Brotherhood became survival. And street life, but the gladiators were sealed off, their lives reduced to training, eating, resting, and enduring. A new recruit might arrive bitter, fearful, defiant. To earn one was rare, but possible. A man who fought bravely, skillfully, repeatedly, and won the crowd's love might one day be granted freedom. The stories of such men circulated like myths within the walls. They gave hope. They made the endless drills bearable. They reminded the fighters that there was a goal beyond pain. The daily grind wore away rough edges. Routine became identity. They would leave the Ludus, travel under guard to the amphitheater, and fight before the crowds. Sometimes they returned victorious. Sometimes they did not return at all. For those who stayed, life went on. The drills resumed. It was a crucible. A place where pain became skill, where fear became focus, where strangers became brothers, where survival meant not just staying alive, but becoming more than what you were when you arrived. The sun rose over the palestra, and the training yard filled once more with the rhythm of effort, the breath of endurance. Over weeks and months, the Ludus turned men into fighters who moved not just with strength, but with instinct. But to the men inside, it was also a place of order, even meaning. Many had arrived in chains, from chaos and trauma. The Ludus offered a structure, however harsh. It gave them a purpose, however deadly. And it gave them each other. They didn't just survive the system, they became part of it. They rarely left the premises except for fights or scheduled appearances. A gladiator who showed promise might be given better food, more rest, better gear. Others resented this. Fights in the yard sometimes turned ugly, but these were contained, monitored. The lanista needed his men intact. He could not afford uncontrolled rage. It had to be channeled, refined, stored until the arena demanded it. They became, in many ways, creatures of the ludus-refined instruments of combat, shaped by repetition and routine. It was not unusual for men to protect one another in training, to give advice, to grieve when a comrade fell. There was even a word for this sacred bond, collesia. Some gladiator schools formed semi-formal brotherhoods or burial clubs, ensuring that if one man died, the others would see him buried with dignity. They trained not just to fight, but to survive, and to make it look good while doing it. Precision mattered more than brute force. A mistimed blow in the arena could mean death. Here, mistakes cost bruises, humiliation, or days of extra labor. They carved graffiti on walls. They gave each other nicknames. They argued and reconciled. They dreamed. A gladiator might spend hours sharpening his weapon, just a little longer than needed, not because it was required, but because it was something he could control. Another might hide a keepsake, a stone or a scrap of cloth, beneath his bedding. Others scribbled names of family, lovers, gods on their gear, small acts of memory in a world trying to make them forget. It forged discipline. It demanded endurance. And among the men who trained side by side, day after day, it built something rare and lasting, brotherhood. Each fighting style had its own techniques and demands. A murmillo wielded a gladius and a large rectangular shield, requiring strength and defense. The threx, with a curved sword and small shield, relied on agility and trickery. The retiarius, with his neck and trident, demanded speed, timing, and an almost theatrical flair. Most ludi were connected to an amphitheatrum, though the largest and most famous stood apart. The ludus magnus, the great gladiator school, stood in the shadow of the Colosseum, a fortress-like complex of dormitories, barracks, courtyards, kitchens, and the all-important palestra, the open-air training yard. A brawler might win a fight, but a trained gladiator won hearts. A missed drill, a sloppy strike, disrespect to a trainer, these might earn beatings, extra labor, or solitary confinement. A runaway could be branded or executed. The men were constantly watched, evaluated not just for skill, but for attitude. A defiant gladiator was a liability. A focused one was gold. The crowds came for beauty as much as blood. A fight that ended too quickly or too clumsily could draw boos instead of cheers. So the lanistae taught their men how to perform. They taught posture, dramatic gestures, how to acknowledge the crowd, how to fall with dignity, how to die if need be. The arena was a stage. Gladiators were actors in armor. Often former gladiators themselves, lanistae understood what it meant to stand in the arena. They knew pain and pride intimately. They also knew profit. At dawn, the corridors echoed with movement-bare feet on stone, the creak of leather, the clatter of gear. Gladiators rose from shared dormitories, where they slept on hard beds, sometimes chained at night, depending on status and trust. They washed, if water was allowed, ate a basic but high-calorie meal, typically barley porridge, beans, dried fruit, and prepared for the day's training. Gladiators were valuable investments, and the ludus was not a slaughterhouse, it was a business. Death in training was waste. The goal was to prepare fighters who could win, survive, and entertain. Gladiators lived, slept, trained, and sometimes died here, their lives tightly regimented under the watchful gaze of the lanista and his staff. The lanista was more than a trainer. He was master, owner, manager, and disciplinarian. Life in the ludus began early. The heart of the ludus was the palestra, a dusty courtyard lined with practice dummies, wooden swords, targets, and weighted equipment. Weapons training was central. Though gladiators were often assigned a specific persona on Milo, Threx, Riciarius, or others, they were exposed to a variety of arms early on. Training partners rotated constantly. This was a world where skill was sacred. Discipline ruled the ludus. Punishments were swift and severe. Yet amid the hardship, bonds grew. Gladiators lived together, trained together, and sometimes fought each other in the arena. Trainers were a different breed. Many were ex-gladiators, scarred, hardened, respected. They commanded both fear and admiration. Outside the ludus, the world kept turning markets, temples, politics, yet despite the regimentation, individuality survived. Within the walls, men still told jokes. And then there were the rivalries. Competition was inevitable. Some men were favored by trainers, by visiting patrons, by the lanista himself. The ludus was not just about building bodies, it was about reshaping minds. And yet, the dream of freedom lingered. Every gladiator knew about the rudis, the symbolic wooden sword that meant release. Every few months, the call would come. Fighters were selected. Their names were announced. To modern eyes, the ludus might seem barbaric, a place where men were shaped into weapons for public amusement. In the end, the gladiator school was not just a training ground. Beneath the spectacle of sword and shield, beneath the thunderous cheers and the slow twist of the emperor's thumb, lay a quieter force that shaped every moment in the arena. Economics. The gladiatorial system of ancient Rome, for all its brutality, was never just about violence. Gladiators were expendable brutes, plucked from obscurity and tossed into combat. Slaves purchased for training could be expensive, especially if they were young, strong, or had prior military experience. Diets were rich in barley, legumes, and dried fruit. A fighter nursing a broken rib or healing from infection wasn't profitable. So most schools had a resident medicus, a doctor trained in treating wounds, bruises, and the many physical punishments of daily training. Equipment had to be maintained as well-practiced swords, armor, helmets, and shields wore down and needed regular repair or replacement. And good armor wasn't cheap. A gladiator's helmet alone could cost as much as a Roman soldier's annual wage. This high-carbohydrate regimen built muscle and stored energy. Meat was rare, but the portions were generous compared to the average Roman poor. Trainers, many of them retired fighters, had to be paid or housed. Terms were negotiated in advance. What type of combat? Who would face whom? What style of weapons? This was a compensation fee paid to the lanista for the loss of a trained fighter. The amount varied depending on the gladiator's skill, popularity, and experience, but it could be staggering. In some cases, the death of a single veteran fighter might cost the equivalent of hundreds of modern thousands in currency. A beloved one could be saved by the sheer force of public affection. A ludus with many survivors had more stars to send into future games. He could command higher fees, attract more patrons, and build a brand. Some gladiators became so popular that they appeared in dozens of matches. Their survival wasn't luck, it was policy. A smart lanista knew when to put his fighters into real danger and when to stage a compelling show. The editor took it all into account. He balanced spectacle with sensibility. A good match balanced danger with drama. A perfect match thrilled the crowd without destroying the asset. Gladiators were warriors, but they were also performers. Gladiators walked into the sand, not as nameless fodder, but as investments. A fighter who died every time offered nothing for tomorrow. In the cold arithmetic of the Colosseum, death had its place, but only when the price was right. Their bodies were trained and maintained with care. Their stories were told and retold by fans, etched into walls and memory. And their deaths, when they happened, were not the rule, but the exception. These deaths were expected. They weren't a part of the regular rotation of trained gladiators, but served to satisfy darker appetites and reinforce Roman authority. And like any professional performer, they relied on repeat appearances to build their name. Killing too many fighters could turn the crowd against him or bankrupt the event. Showing mercy at the right moment could inspire applause and admiration. Gladiators who lived long enough could even earn their freedom. A skilled retiarius fast, agile, lightly armored, wasn't usually thrown against a hulking Murmillo just for the fun of it. The match had to be fair, or at least believable. A mismatch might end too quickly, wasting the opportunity for a good show. The financial success of the game depended on tension, on pacing, on the illusion that anything could happen, even if the lanista had carefully calculated the odds. Winning several fights, gaining public favor, or receiving a gift of the rubies meant they could retire, start businesses, or even return to the ludus as trainers. In doing so, they preserved their value for the system, not as expendables, but as living legends. The organizers paid appearance fees, prize money, and travel costs if needed. Fighters were paired with opponents of similar skill. Referees monitored the combat, ready to step in. When one fighter fell or conceded, the editor of the games, the man in charge, would make the final decision. Sometimes, yes, death was ordered. But often, especially when the vanquished had fought bravely, mercy was shown. The defeated fighter might raise a finger in surrender, appealing to the crowd and the editor. If the audience was pleased with his performance, it might call for his life to be spared. Some events required special setups, exotic animals, or elaborate sets, all of which drove up costs. By the time he was ready to fight, he was a walking pile of sunk costs. Losing him in a single bout was like burning down a villa for a fireplace's warmth. It happened, but only when necessary. Guards ensured discipline. Administrators handled records and bookings. A mid-sized ludus could operate like a small fortress, with all the overhead that entailed. Ancient sources suggest the signs were more complex, with gestures indicating whether a blade should be drawn across the throat or sheathed. But the underlying truth remains. The decision to kill wasn't automatic. It was a moment of judgment, moral, emotional, and financial. And looming over all this were taxes, licensing fees for participation in public games, and bribes. Rome was nothing if not corrupt. Feeding dozens, sometimes hundreds, of men every day required not only food, but cooks, storage, and logistics. Prisoners of war were sometimes sold cheaply after a major conflict, but in quieter years, a good recruit might command a premium. A successful fighter could appear in multiple games over many years. Each time he stepped into the arena, he brought with him the potential for victory, excitement, and crowd appeal. Held in amphitheaters across the empire, most famously, the Colosseum in Rome, they were sponsored by wealthy elites seeking public favor. Senators, emperors, and rising politicians paid out of pocket to host games as gifts to the people, earning social capital in return. The bigger the spectacle, the more glory they gained. But even these patrons had budgets. Fighters who survived became known by name, gaining reputations like modern athletes. Fans remembered their style, their victories, even their scars. Promoters used them to draw crowds. Patrons placed bets. The bigger the name, the bigger the profit. Free men who volunteered to become gladiators, called octorati, often demanded upfront payments or contracts promising future rewards. These men might even bring legal complications with them, depending on their background or debts. They were trained, fed, housed, equipped, and maintained at significant expense. The lanista, the man who owned and trained gladiators, had to run his ludus, the gladiator school, like a business. And the business model wasn't built on losing fighters every time the crowd cried for blood. It was also a business intricate, expensive, and strategic. Every fighter in the sand represented an investment. Every drop of blood had a cost. And in this world of coin and calculation, killing a gladiator too often wasn't just cruel, it was bad business. To understand why gladiators didn't always fight to the death, we must first understand what it took to get them into the arena at all. First, there was the cost of acquisition. A skilled fighter didn't appear from nowhere. Once acquired, the real expenses began. The gladiator had to be fed, and not just kept alive, but physically primed for combat. Housing also mattered. Gladiators lived on site at the ludus. They needed beds, blankets, clean water, sanitation, and in many cases, medical care. Then came the staff. The lanista rarely ran things alone. In all, training a gladiator could take months, even years. For a well-trained gladiator, the real profits came in performance. And so, for the lanista and those who financed the games, a living gladiator was far more valuable than a dead one. The games themselves, known as minera, were expensive affairs. Each match had to be arranged. Fighters were contracted out by their lanistae. Killing a gladiator raised the price dramatically. If the crowd demanded death, or if the organizer wanted a climactic finale, he had to pay a premium known as the pretium. For that reason alone, many matches were never intended to end in death. The famous thumbs up or thumbs down gesture, so often dramatized in film, wasn't quite what we imagine. Sometimes the crowd played a part. A hated or cowardly fighter might be condemned by their cries. For the lanista, sparing his fighters was crucial to business. This didn't mean the fights were fake. Blades were sharp. Wounds were real. Blood was spilled. But death wasn't always the end goal. There were exceptions. Some games were staged as executions. Criminals, rebels, or Nazi-condemned prisoners were forced to fight to the death or against animals in one-sided slaughter. But the more prized the fighter, the more likely he was to be spared. The economics of the arena also shaped matchups. Ultimately, the arena was a marketplace of flesh, spectacle, and survival. Rome understood the power of a good fight, but it also understood the power of survival. A fighter who fell and rose again inspired awe. In the shadow of every great gladiator, behind the roar of the crowd and the gleam of bloodied steel, stood another figure, less famous, less glorified, but every bit as essential to the brutal machinery of Roman spectacle. The lanista was no warrior in shining armor. He did not fight in the arena or risk his life before the emperor. But the truth was far more layered. The lanista was responsible for the health, behavior, skill development, and public image of every man under his control. He managed a roster like a sports coach, with contracts, rivalries, training regimens, and tactical decisions. He had to know which fighters to push, which to protect, and which to promote. He purchased slaves and prisoners at auctions or directly from magistrates. He enforced a hierarchy. Experienced veterans above new recruits, star fighters above unknowns. He delegated training to seasoned instructors, but remained the final authority. If a man disobeyed or underperformed, the lanista dealt punishment. He had to know their limits, their old injuries, their mental states, their winning streaks. But the behind-the-scenes decisions often tilted the odds. A veteran might face a rookie for an easy win. A fight might be stopped at the right moment to preserve both men. The lanista wasn't just watching from the sidelines. He was playing a long game, shaping careers, calculating risk, and protecting his assets. Sending a weary fighter to face a fresh opponent could be a death sentence. He saw them daily in training, in pain, in fear, in laughter. Over time, bonds could form. Some lanistae became father figures to their fighters, especially to those who had arrived as boys. They buried the dead with care. A few became patrons in their own right, building temples, endowing public works, or even sitting beside senators at games. He was a pragmatist. He understood that death had its place, but life, especially a life that could be trained, shaped, and reused, was more valuable. A dead gladiator made for a memorable moment. A living one made for a profitable business. They walked a narrow road between fame and infamy, and they did so with purpose. But the Lanista, watching from the shadows, always counted the cost. He was the quiet master behind the thunder, the man who made the games possible, the one who knew that in Rome, even blood had a price, and it was his job to make sure it paid. They arranged for a retired fighter's future, whether as a trainer, a guard, or even a free man with land. Not every school was humane, but not every master was cruel. In the brutal logic of the ludus, kindness sometimes had a place, if only because it bred loyalty. Staging a fight between two equally exhausted men could end in anticlimax. The matches had to be exciting but survivable. They were often wealthy and influential, but they were also stigmatized. With a single nod, he could end a man's career. With a few words, he could grant a second chance. His decisions echoed in the amphitheater, in the hearts of fans, in the records scratched onto amphorae and scratched into walls. He controlled not only who lived and died, but who became a legend. Romans looked down on those who profited from death in spectacle. To be a Lanista was to live in a moral gray zone. You were necessary, but never quite respectable. He had to know when to push a fighter forward and when to hold him back. He had to sense when a man was losing his edge, or when the crowd had grown tired of a style. He had to market his fighters like stars, balancing mystery and familiarity. Too many appearances dulled a name. Too few, and the audience forgot. Even freedmen who rose through the ranks to own their own ludi found themselves shut out of polite society. The Senate might cheer your gladiators in the arena, but at dinner, your name was whispered with distaste. If the editor of the games, often a wealthy patron or political figure, wanted a particular outcome, the Lanista had to deliver, or at least make it seem authentic. Whippings, extra labor, loss of food rations, or solitary confinement, all were tools in his arsenal. Discipline was non-negotiable. A disobedient gladiator could be a dead one and a financial liability. He reviewed potential octorati-free men volunteering to join the ludus and negotiated their contracts. These decisions could make or break a school. A few strong recruits could transform a struggling luducinto a profitable enterprise. A series of weak or ill-suited fighters could drain resources quickly. A good Lanista didn't just train men to fight. He trained them to win and to survive. Instead, he profited from those who did. Equal parts manager, trainer, trader, and sometimes tormentor, the Lanista ran the business of blood. The Lanista also needed his fighters to trust him, or at least respect him. Patrons sought them out for major games, requesting certain names or matchups. Like modern sports agents, these managers negotiated appearance fees, bonuses, and travel arrangements. A popular fighter might bring in significant income, not just from the games, but from public appearances, murals, or even merchandise. The Lanista controlled it all. Gladiators might live under threat, but they also relied on their master for survival. He arranged their meals, ensured their medical treatment, and protected them from unnecessary danger. A competent Lanista earned a grudging loyalty from his men. In some ludi, this relationship deepened into genuine camaraderie. In others, fear ruled. Much depended on the man himself and the nature of his school. Without him, the games could not exist. In many ways, the Lanista embodied the Roman genius for systems. The empire ran on organization roads, legions, aqueducts, taxation, and the gladiator industry was no exception. Gladiators did not spring forth ready-made for battle. They had to be purchased, trained, housed, fed, healed, and booked into matches. They needed discipline and direction, and that entire operation fell under the control of the Lanista. Gladiators were expensive to maintain, and every decision had financial weight. Training required food, gear, constructors, and facilities. A careless injury in practice could delay a fight, and a delayed fight meant lost income. A fighter sent to a poorly matched bout could be killed, and with him, months or years of investment gone in a moment. Even a victorious gladiator, if overused, could burn out or suffer long-term damage. The lanista had to balance risk and reward with a gambler's nerve and a general's discipline. At first glance, his role might seem simple. He ran the ludus, the gladiator school, and prepared fighters for combat. Most lanistae were former gladiators themselves, or ex-soldiers who understood violence firsthand. Their experience gave them credibility and authority. They had been inside the arena. They knew what it took to stand beneath the sun, sword drawn, heart pounding, with thousands chanting for blood. They had earned their scars. That authenticity mattered. It gave them command over the men they now trained. But experience alone wasn't enough. The lanista had to be a businessman, and a shrewd one. One of the lanista's most critical responsibilities was selecting new recruits. Once in the school, new gladiators fell under strict discipline. The lanista set the tone, but cruelty alone wasn't enough. Some lanistae developed reputations across the empire. Their fighters became known for specific tactics or styles. Behind every arena contract was careful planning. The lanista had to match his fighters strategically. That line between spectacle and manipulation was always delicate. Fights were real. Blood was real. Still, not every decision was purely financial. The lanista lived with his men. For all their importance, however, lanistae occupied a strange social position. And yet, the lanista held power. He was a curator of violence, but also of glory. The lanista's success depended not just on strength and ruthlessness, but on patience, intuition, and timing. The most successful lanistae created dynasties. Their schools produced generations of fighters. Their names appeared in records across the empire. Some were granted special privileges by the emperor. In the end, the lanista was not a bloodthirsty villain. The crowd might scream for death. The emperor might signal the final blow. To the casual Roman spectator, a gladiator was a symbol of courage, ferocity, and raw strength. He was a figure to be cheered, feared, and admired, his battles the centerpiece of the public games. From acquisition to combat, from injury to retirement, every stage of a gladiator's life was tracked like that of a prized racehorse or merchant ship. Each man came with a cost, the price paid for his body, the expense of his training, the upkeep of his health, the cost of equipment, food, housing, and the wages of those tasked with keeping him alive. And those who funded this system, lanistae, speculators, or silent investors, did not do so out of charity. Helmets dented, shields splintered, swords dulled, protective padding wore out. And the better a fighter was, the more finely tuned his equipment needed to be. For star performers, customized gear became part of the brand. A Murmillo might have a crested helmet so distinctive that crowds recognized him from across the arena. That visibility increased his fame and his fee, but it came at a price. They expected returns. And the best return came not from a glorious death, but from repeat appearances. But that cost was not sunk. It was an investment to be recouped, ideally many times over. In a city as commercially sophisticated as Rome, insurance mechanisms, though primitive by modern standards, were not unheard of. If a star gladiator was going to perform in a particularly risky event, the lanista might pay a third party to guarantee compensation in the event of his death. In some cases, the organizer of the games was required to pay a pretium, a set price, to cover the fighter's loss if he were killed. The more valuable the gladiator, the higher the fee. A veteran of 10 victories might cost as much as a luxury villa if he died in the sand. A fight that ended in the first 2 minutes with a clean kill could feel disappointing. But a prolonged, balanced duel full of reversals, skillful defense, near victories, and mutual exhaustion delighted the crowd. If the defeated gladiator had fought bravely, the audience might chant for mercy. They understood, on some level, that the best entertainment came not from one death, but from many survivals. When the organizer of a game, the editor contracted fighters for an event, they negotiated a fee with the Lanista. Lesser-known fighters fetched a modest sum. They never heard the negotiations, the debates over which fighter to send, who was worth the risk, or what the price of a kill would be. But behind every fight was a boardroom in miniature. The Lanista weighed the odds. The game's organizer counted coins. The crowd counted heartbeats. And somewhere in the center of it all, a man with a sword waited for the gates to open. Instead, schools emphasized control, defense, and performance. A good gladiator knew how to wound, how to disarm, how to stage drama. Killing an opponent too quickly ended the match too soon. Taking too many risks increased the odds of injury. The goal was to win, yes, but also to live to fight again. A stunning draw, a dramatic surrender, or even an injury could satisfy the crowd's thirst while preserving the asset. In matches between stablemates fighters from the same school, there were often unspoken agreements. They knew what their owner wanted. They knew how far to push each other. A bloody show, yes, but not a bloodbath. He might serve as a celebrity guest, a judge, a mentor to new recruits. His name could still draw a crowd, even if his sword arm had grown slow. Some gladiators lived long enough to see their former selves painted on tavern walls, their battles recited by poets, their armor displayed in shrines. Not if it meant losing 2 assets for the price of 1. The economic logic was simple. Better a live fighter who could return next month than a dead one whose only value was the short-lived roar of the arena. They might stage rivalries, encourage grudges, or choreograph certain sequences. But they rarely left things entirely to chance. They couldn't afford to. Every fighter was a balancing act between danger and return, between blood and profit. Veterans, specialists, or rising stars might demand several times that amount. A few earned enough money through prize winnings, bonuses, and gifts to buy their freedom. These were the lucky few who were granted the rudies, the symbolic wooden sword of release. If they had pleased the crowd and the emperor, if their Lanista agreed, and if they survived enough matches, they could leave the ludus as free men. Some bought land, others opened taverns, or even returned to the school as trainers, bringing their fame with them. On one hand, it meant their owners had a vested interest in keeping them alive. Injuries were patched not out of compassion, but out of necessity. Food and rest were calculated precisely. And when a fighter ceased to be profitable due to age, decline, or behavior, he could be sold, retired, or discarded. Some Lanistae treated their men with decency. Others viewed them as livestock. A smart Lanista wouldn't throw a promising gladiator into hopeless matches just to test him. He'd build a fighter's reputation, slowly pitting him against manageable opponents, allowing time for recovery between fights and staging occasional mismatches where victory was all but guaranteed. This careful cultivation increased fame and earning potential. The Lanista was careful. He weighed the risk of injury or death against the payout. Was the opponent evenly matched? But behind every gesture of generosity, the calculation remained. How long would this man last? And how much could he earn before his luck and body ran out? Was the host known for brutal games or for drama and showmanship? Would the arena provide proper safety, timely medical attention, fair referees? But to the men who owned and trained them, gladiators were something else entirely. Assets. Was the game in a backwater town with little publicity? Or was it in Rome, in front of thousands, possibly even the emperor? They followed the careers of their favorites, like modern fans follow athletes. They remembered spectacular dodges, heroic comebacks, devastating kills. The more famous a fighter became, the more crowds wanted to see him fight again. For the Lanista, this was gold. A famous gladiator could be rented out for special events, lend his name to public murals, or even become the face of a school. A high-profile match could boost a fighter's fame overnight. And fame, in the gladiatorial world, meant money. They were walking investments, carefully evaluated, financially maintained, and expected to yield returns. Gladiators ate a high-carb diet rich in barley, legumes, and dried fruit, fueling the development of thick muscle and energy reserves. A hungry gladiator didn't train well and couldn't fight at all. Medical care was just as essential. Cuts, fractures, and infections were frequent. A single abscess, left untreated, could kill a man in days. So most ludi kept doctors on site, trained in practical battlefield medicine. Salves, bindings, herbal mixtures, surgeries, these were not luxuries. They were maintenance costs. In the world behind the arena's velvet dust, where ledgers were studied more closely than swords, the gladiator's value was measured not in bravery, but in coin. The business of blood was complex. It began at the point of purchase. Whether a slave bought at auction, a prisoner handed over by magistrates, or a free man who signed away years of his life for money, each gladiator had a starting price. Some were cheap, sickly, or unruly. Others were young, muscular, and brimming with potential. A seasoned eye could see which ones might flourish under training, and which would never make it through the first year. The price paid was often just the beginning. Once within the ludus, the real spending began. The school bore every cost. Food was basic, but calorically dense. Weapons and armor were another drain on resources. Even if reused across fighters, the gear required constant repair. Every coin spent added to a gladiator's cost of production. Each match offered a chance to do just that. Even more important was the match's visibility. Crowds loved familiar names. The most successful fighters earned bonuses, gifts, and privileges. To protect these assets, some Lannister turned to insurance. This system provided an incentive not to demand death in every match. A well-fought loss could still entertain. For the fighters themselves, this financial reality was a double-edged sword. On the other hand, the gladiator was constantly reminded that his life was a number in someone else's ledger. But within the system, some fighters rose to astonishing heights. Interestingly, the economic thinking extended even to the audience. Crowds did not always want to see death. They wanted a show. The economics of gladiator life also influenced how fighters were trained. It made no sense to train a man to kill recklessly or to die gloriously. Veterans taught the younger men these truths. They shared strategies, sometimes even cut deals. In some cases, Lannister themselves orchestrated these outcomes. Even retirement was sometimes calculated. A fighter nearing the end of his career could be used in less risky events. The audience never saw the ledgers. He was more than a fighter. He was an investment. And as long as he lived, he paid. To the roaring crowds that flooded into Rome's amphitheaters, be it the towering majesty of the Colosseum or a provincial stone ring on the edge of empire, the gladiatorial games promised a taste of something electric. They came not merely for death, but for the thrill of spectacle, for the weightless pause between strike and counterstrike, for the gasp of a near-fatal blow, for the slow pivot of a victor raising his sword. Rather, it resembled a well-paced story, each act building upon the last. In the morning, there might be wild beast hunts venations, where trained hunters, or sometimes criminals, faced lions, bears, or boars. The crowd loved watching the dance of light versus heavy, speed versus force. These were less acrobatic, but just as intense blows that rang across the amphitheater, shields splintering under relentless impact. These officials weren't ornamental. They were respected former gladiators themselves, chosen for their experience. Their presence reinforced that this was not chaos, it was a contest. Then came the moment that most remembered, the judgment. This tension kept the audience enthralled. And from a narrative standpoint, a fighter spared after a valiant loss could return in the next games, more famous than before. A fighter who knew he could earn mercy if he fought bravely had incentive to give the crowd a good show, to fall with dignity, to bleed dramatically, but continue until the final moment, to accept defeat not with cowardice, but with resignation. In this way, even losing became performance, and the audience, moved by the spectacle, might reward that performance with the ultimate gift life. The editors in Lannister understood this cycle well. It was a form of serial storytelling, each fight another chapter in a growing legend. When Commodus fought in the arena, not risking much, but posturing nonetheless, it wasn't because he wanted to murder. It was because he wanted to thrill. The image of the ruler fighting, or the favored gladiator returning from injury, stirred the people. Their excitement fed the spectacle, and the spectacle fed the empire's grip on its citizens. Fighters whose names rang out like modern celebrities. The crowd followed their careers, placed bets, wore painted amulets bearing their likeness. These men were spared more often, promoted more widely, and cheered more loudly. Some even had fan clubs women who wrote letters, admirers who carved their names on walls. For them, death was the finale no one wanted, not yet. The emperor or sponsor might glance to the people, listen to their cheers or boos, and then issue a command mercy or execution. The sand arena in Latin soaked up blood, but also served as a symbolic canvas. It was a place where stories were written in sweat and scars. Some men, when death was ordered, fell with theatrical grace, collapsing in poses reminiscent of statues. Painted signs introduced fighters, bragged of past victories, taunted rivals. Sometimes fights were themed staged as recreations of mythological battles. Other times, exotic armor or rare matchups added novelty. All of it crafted to sustain interest. Gladiator games were not carnage for carnage's sake. They were entertainment Rome's blockbuster theater. They came to see him live as if he might. Others fought their final moments fiercely, earning roars of admiration. A good death could elevate a man's name to the level of myth, but the best outcome was to live again and to return. Fight well and live again. Fight poorly and vanish. Every match was a performance. Every wound a moment of suspense. The arena was a place of danger. Yes, but above all, it was a place of drama. In popular fiction, we often imagine a simple thumbs up or thumbs down, deciding life or death, but the reality was more ambiguous. They wanted to feel something. Awe, horror, joy, relief. The fights delivered this not by a steady stream of corpses, but by tension, pacing, and surprise. Like a good play, the games followed arcs beginnings, middles, climaxes. Too much violence, too quickly, and the crowd grew numb. But a slow, grinding duel, followed by a sudden turn, that brought them to their feet. And some editors, particularly those hoping to impress, might allow more deaths to occur. But even then, death was not guaranteed. The goal was not extermination. It was escalation, rising tension, emotional peaks, breathtaking skill, and occasionally, the shock of a fatal blow. If every match ended in the same outcome, the drama would collapse. What kept audiences coming back was unpredictability. Ancient sources suggest gestures were made, but their meaning depended on context. Perhaps a turned thumb indicated the drawing of a blade rather than a sentence to die. There were rules, even if the blood made people forget them. The audience watched not only for action, but for endurance. Who would outlast the other? Estimates suggest that only around 10 to 20% of bouts resulted in a fatality, and even that varied depending on the time, the place, and the generosity of the editor. Gladiators cost money to train, and killing them for sport in every fight would be ruinous for their owners. More importantly, the crowd didn't always demand death. What they wanted was valor. They wanted to see a man fight well, bravely, cleverly, fiercely. If a fighter lost with honor, he could earn not only his life, but admiration. Who would show the greater stamina, the better footwork, the cooler mind? Would the net entangle? Or would the trident miss its mark? Would the slow, shielded brute corner the agile hunter? These battles could last for minutes, sometimes more, drawing cries and cheers from the audience with every narrow escape or sudden shift in advantage. These served to awaken the crowd, to stir the senses with spectacle and danger. But the real anticipation came later in the day, when the main event approached. Man against man, steel against flesh. The games were carefully crafted theater, an elaborate dance of danger and suspense. Not all fights ended in death, because not all fights were meant to. In the Roman imagination, the arena was a place of ultimate trial, but it was also a stage. Every element, the sand, the architecture, the weapons, the announcers, even the timing of each event, was designed to hold the crowd in rapt attention. Just as playwrights and poets constructed crescendos in their art, so too did those who planned the munera, the gladiatorial contests. Their goal was to keep the audience not merely satisfied, but hungry. Hungry for more fights, more drama, more awe. The day of games usually followed a structured rhythm. It was not a chaotic free-for-all of death and noise. The fights were never random. Each matchup was chosen with care by the editor of the games, the patron who sponsored the event, often a politician seeking favor with the crowd. He might consult with Lannister to arrange specific pairings, weighing reputation, style, and narrative potential. This was not unlike a modern boxing promoter selecting fighters for an undercard or championship bout. There were arcs to be told, veterans seeking redemption, young upstarts proving themselves, rivals clashing again after a controversial draw. Each match was a story waiting to unfold, and the audience, whether plebeian or patrician, craved that narrative. Certain pairings were popular for their contrast. A nimble Retiarius, armed with net and trident, might be pitted against the heavy-armored Secure. Others matched equals, two Murmilos, both heavily armored, battering each other in brute, calculated exchanges. Fights were presided over by referees Summa Rudis and Secunda Rudis, who monitored the combat. Ensured rules were followed, and intervened if one man yielded or was clearly overmatched. Contrary to modern myths, the vast majority of matches did not end in death. When a gladiator was wounded or defeated, he could raise his finger in supplication, appealing to the editor in the crowd. Still, the dramatic pause was real. The decision became a moment of suspense. Would the fallen man rise again? Would his courage be rewarded? Would mercy be granted? For the gladiators, this made survival both possible and desirable. Of course, some fights did end in death, especially if a man fought poorly, cowardly, or was already unpopular. Gladiators themselves played into this. They learned how to act, how to die well if they had to. The crowd's hunger wasn't for death itself, but for catharsis. Organizers knew this, and so did the emperors. Even the amphitheaters themselves were designed for effect. The oval shape allowed everyone a view. The sunken arena kept the action contained and focused. Musicians played, announcers called out names, and like any entertainment industry, there were stars. In the end, the truth of the gladiators' world was not simple. It was not just kill or be killed. It was show or be forgotten, because the crowd came not to see a man die. To the untrained eye, the Roman arena might have looked like a place without law, a battlefield where blood was the only outcome, where violence reigned unchecked, and the strongest man simply triumphed by sheer force. But that illusion, carefully cultivated for the excitement of the audience, masked a deeper truth. Gladiator combat was not chaos. These weren't written down like Roman legal codes, but they were well understood by those who participated: the gladiators, the Lannister, the referees, and the sponsors. Contrary to popular belief, few were expected to end fatally unless clearly stated. The standard was usually ad panem until one combatant acknowledged defeat, either by raising a finger or by a visible gesture of submission. This allowed for dramatic fights without automatically dooming one of the participants. They were often retired gladiators themselves, men who understood the realities of the arena. They carried staff's roadies to separate fighters, halt combat, and communicate instructions. Their role was complex. They ensured fair play, enforced rules, protected the defeated, and maintained the pace and rhythm of the match. In some ways, they were choreographers of danger, making sure the dance remained both thrilling and just. The raised podium around the arena floor meant there was no escape once the gate closed. If both fighters remained standing after a long period, sometimes half an hour or more, the referee might call for a draw or allow the editor to choose the winner. Prolonged stalemates were discouraged. The point was excitement, not exhaustion. Even bloodthirsty crowds preferred intensity to slog. A man who broke conduct might be fined, beaten, or denied further matches. From their first week in the ludus, new gladiators learned not only how to swing a sword or raise a shield, but how to fight with control. The sparring matches were not only physical tests, they were behavioral instruction. They were understood signals of submission. Once made, they froze the match. The referee stepped in. The editor or sponsor decided. And in that moment, the fate of the man life or death hung, not on the sword, but on judgment. They learned how to time a surrender, how to bleed just enough for drama, how to fall convincingly without risking a limb. Like boxing or wrestling, there were weight classes, styles, expectations. It was training, strategy, defense. Even the deaths, when they occurred, were often procedural rather than chaotic. They were part of the story tragic finales, not random outbursts. Rules drawn not in ink, but in the sand beneath their feet. These tactics learned in hard practice kept them alive for dozens of matches. Veterans passed them on in whispers. How to read the referee's eyes, how to anticipate the crowd's mood, how to use the rules to your advantage. And as their feet stirred the sand, their minds always held them close. The code of combat etched deeper than the blade. Do not kill unless told. Do not gloat. Do not fall too easily. Do not stand too long. A crowd favorite might be spared even if he lost quickly. Gladiators still died unjustly. They were still property, often coerced, always under threat. The rules gave form to their lives, but never full safety. At best, the rules made survival possible. At worst, they offered a thin veil of honor to a brutal spectacle. The referees, the editor, the crowd, and the gods all seemed to play a hand. But throughout it all, the rules kept the chaos in check. They were the quiet language beneath the noise, the order inside the blood. Respect your opponent, your audience, your master. For many fighters, especially those with little control over their own lives, this was strange territory. A life built not on freedom, but on discipline. In some cases, a gladiator who defied the referee's decision or attacked him could be executed on the spot. Such events were rare, but their existence reinforced the seriousness of the rules. The arena was dangerous, but it was not lawless. Fighters could not flee into the audience, nor could they use environmental elements outside their designated weapons. Fighters might be tethered together by a rope. They might be blindfolded or forced to fight in uneven terrain. To fight according to the rules meant to fight with honor. A man who surrendered properly, fought cleanly, and obeyed the commands of the referees might be spared, even if he lost. He might be remembered as dignus vita worthy of life. The audience respected not just skill, but virtue. In these cases, special conditions were announced beforehand, and both fighters knew what to expect. These gimmick fights, while rare, were crowd pleasers, but still the rules remained. Even chaos had limits. Every inch of movement was visible to thousands of eyes. The sand absorbed blood, but also showed footprints, falls, and signs of fatigue. There was no hiding everything was recorded in motion. They governed everything from how a fight could begin, to how it could end, to what techniques and tactics were permitted. If one fighter refused to yield despite overwhelming odds, the referee might pause the fight, consult with the editor of the games, or allow the crowd to influence the decision. Gladiators were trained to aim for weak spots, to get under the helmet, behind the shield, between the plates. But there was a clear distinction between tactical targeting and cruelty. Deliberately disfiguring a fellow fighter, or refusing to stop after a submission, could lead to punishment, or worse, losing the crowd's favor, which in Rome could be more dangerous than any blade. At all times, he was watching for intent. Did the fighters aim to kill or to dominate? Was the combat clean or dishonorable? In the dust and sun of the amphitheater, these invisible laws were as binding as iron chains. It was rule-bound, codified, refereed. There were boundaries. There were expectations. Cheering encouraged combatants to continue. Boos or silence indicated boredom or disapproval. If a fighter behaved dishonorably, say, refusing to fight or attacking after a surrender, the audience might demand his punishment or even death, regardless of the match's outcome. Gladiators knew this. They played to the crowd, not only for fame, but for survival. There was a silent code etched not only in practice, but in sand. At the center of this structure were the rules of combat, the guidelines that shaped every bout. Each match began with a set of decisions. Was it to the first blood? Until surrender? Until incapacitation? Or until death? Not all matches were the same. The combat styles themselves were defined and carefully balanced. Gladiators were trained in specific roles: Murmillo, Threx, Retiarius, Secutor, Hoplomachus, among others, and their gear, weapons, and tactics were chosen to complement or challenge one another. A Murmillo with his broad shield and heavy gladius would often face a Threx, who used a smaller shield and curved blade. The matchups were intended to be fair in principle, even if individual skill could tip the balance. There were unwritten rules of engagement that every gladiator learned during training. These included things like not striking a man who had clearly yielded, not continuing to attack an unarmed opponent who had lost his weapon, and not using underhanded tactics such as sand throwing or biting unless the nature of the match allowed for particularly brutal conduct. To break these conventions was to risk the ire of the referees, and more dangerously, the disfavor of the crowd. Referees, known as the Summa Rudis and the Secunda Rudis, were not ornamental. When a fighter lost his weapon or fell, the Summa Rudis would often step in immediately, sometimes stopping the match if it was clear the man could not continue, or giving him a chance to retrieve his gear. Even armor strikes were subject to judgment. The crowd, in fact, formed an informal rule-book of its own. Their reactions shaped the fight's direction. The structure of the arena itself enforced certain rules. The oval shape prevented easy retreat. There were also rules regarding length. A fight could not go on indefinitely. For more dramatic duels, some games introduced extra layers of rule. Penalties existed for disobedience. A gladiator who refused to fight could be whipped or prodded by officials. The training schools drilled these rules into every man. But within this structure, there was also a strange dignity. Even the symbols of surrender had their own ritual. Raising a finger, kneeling with head bowed, or lying flat on the sand with arms outstretched, these were not improvised gestures. That judgment was not always predictable. An unpopular man might be condemned despite fighting well. Over time, some gladiators became experts not only in combat, but in navigating the rules. Some modern historians have even argued that the games had more in common with sports than battlefields. But no rule, no matter how old or sacred, could guarantee fairness. Yet for the fighters inside the arena, the rules mattered. They were the difference between madness and order, between a chance to rise again and a meaningless end. They may have fought for survival, for freedom, or for fame, but they fought within rules. The Roman amphitheater, with its wide tiers of stone, its roar of 100,000 voices, and its stage set in blood-stained sand, was more than a place of death. It was a place of judgment. But the judgment did not rest solely with the sword, nor even with the referee, pacing in the shadows with his staff. Rome's great masses, so often overlooked in the political workings of the republic or empire, held sway in this sacred, savage ritual. When a gladiator fell, either wounded beyond further combat or simply outmatched, he could appeal for mercy by lifting a finger, usually the index. This was not a signal of defeat alone. It was a plea, spare me. If a man had fought bravely, skillfully, or nobly, they were more likely to grant him mercy. A wave of approval, hands raised, voices chanting the name of a favored fighter. The idea of the thumbs up meaning spare him, and thumbs down meaning kill, is likely a later invention. Ancient texts suggest that pollis verso, a term often translated as turned thumb, could mean different things in context. A thumb turned up might represent a drawn sword, thus death. Those who didn't fight with flair, or those who had displeased the audience in previous games. Sometimes it was strategic. A favorite fighter might be spared to return in future games. The crowd liked familiar faces. They followed careers. A match between two popular fighters might end with a clear victor, but both spared. The crowd would be thrilled by the display and not want to lose either man. The poor, the enslaved, even many citizens had no say in governance, law, or fate, would not fall to their knees. They met death standing. These men were rare, and they were remembered. But many others pleaded with everything they had: gestures, looks, silent prayers, a glance to the stands, a whisper to the gods, because if the crowd chose life, there was still hope. But here, in the amphitheater, they ruled, they decided, and their decisions echoed in eternity. It made them human, or at least gave them the veneer of humanity. For what is more Roman than the illusion of choice, the spectacle of control, the stage upon which fate could be argued, even if only by noise? Chose to remain and fight. He was spared repeatedly, beloved by the people, not just for his skill, but for his heart. His story illustrates that mercy, once granted, became its own kind of myth. A man spared became legend. A man killed became memory. For the man on his knees in the sand, bleeding and broken, there was no higher authority than that tide of voices rising around him. It became the dramatic turning point, the moment the entire amphitheater leaned in. Others, like Caligula or Commodus, leaned into cruelty, using the crowd's voice as cover for their own bloodlust. But always the performance remained, the moment of pause, the finger raised, the breathless silence before the cheer. It wasn't just about death, it was about choice, about morality, about spectacle, yes, but also justice, or the illusion of it. They cheered for the victor, and then, often louder, for the vanquished. His body a map of wounds, his chest rising, his eyes darting to the stands. And the people rose not just in their seats, but in judgment. They raised their voices, they raised their hands. And for one heartbeat, it was not the emperor, nor the blade, nor the gods who decided. This dynamic ensured that the games maintained their supply of fighters, while also offering the audience a sense of justice and agency. They had their heroes and villains. Gladiators were public figures in a society that didn't yet have celebrities in the modern sense. A long day of games, especially one filled with uneventful matches, could sour the crowd. They wanted a climax, a spectacle. And if the final bout of the day ended with one man asking for mercy, the people might refuse out of boredom or disappointment, or just the swelling energy of the moment. A man might fight bravely, but if the story felt incomplete, the crowd could demand an ending. And in Rome, endings often came with a blade. To see a beloved fighter spared meant the drama could continue. A rematch could be built, stories could grow. A man killed could not entertain again, and the crowd, ever hungry for the next event, understood this well. Their mercy was less certain. They could be spared if their opponent showed restraint or the editor saw something redeeming, but without the crowd, their fates were far more precarious. A thumb clenched inside the fist might mean mercy, but more than gestures, it was the sound that decided. The swell of noise, the unified voice of thousands, that was the true sentence. At other times, the rejection was cold, silent, unmoved, almost surgical. A thumb turned, a gesture given, a life extinguished. It was theater, yes, but theater with a real cost. The people admired virtues, the Roman ideal of courage, strength, and manliness. A gladiator who displayed virtues might lose the match, but win the crowd. And that could mean everything. Appeasing the people mattered. If he spared a man the crowd wanted dead, he risked losing favor. A well-placed roar, a dramatic fall, a salute before the match, bold and defiant. These details lingered in the public mind, and when it came time to raise a finger in surrender, such men often lived to fight again. If he ordered an execution the crowd had clearly opposed, he might leave the arena under a cloud of shame. In some extreme cases, riots even broke out when the crowd felt the decision had violated their will. The arena may have had a hierarchy, but within its walls, public opinion was not just background noise, it was law. The act froze the match. The Summa Rudis, the chief referee, would step in to pause the action. The surviving opponent would step back, sword lowered but at the ready. And then all eyes turned to the stands. And they knew it, but rarely did he act in a vacuum. He looked to the people. He listened, for it was their cheers or lack thereof that gave him license to be merciful or cruel. A crowd erupting in approval for a gallant loser often swayed the editor to spare the man. A restless, disappointed audience might demand blood. And in that precarious silence between battle and verdict, the whole of Roman civilization seemed to breathe as one. It lay, ultimately, with the people. Thousands of eyes fixed on two fighters below. Thousands of hearts pounding with the rhythm of violence and spectacle. And when the moment came, when one man faltered, collapsed, or lifted his finger in plea, it was not the emperor alone who decided. It was the crowd. Rome, for all its hierarchy and brutal discipline, handed power to its people in strange ways. And in the gladiatorial arena, perhaps more than anywhere else, that power was palpable. Here, citizens rich and poor, slave and senator gathered in a rare unity of purpose. They watched. They judged. They chose. Life or death. Not in abstract terms, but in real, immediate consequence. A shout could save a man. A cheer could spare a life. And a wave of disapproval could condemn someone to die where they knelt, hands trembling, in the dirt. This was not mercy granted in private, nor by priestly decree. It was public, messy, emotional, sometimes inconsistent. Yet it was real. To understand the role of the crowd, we must first understand the moment of submission, the missio. The decision rested officially with the editor of the games, the patron, magistrate, or emperor who sponsored the event. Crowds could be complex. They weren't always bloodthirsty, contrary to modern caricature. They wanted drama. Yes, but also honor. At times, the mercy granted was thunderous. There has long been confusion about the gesture itself. What did Romans actually do to signal life or death? And those voices held immense influence, especially when the editor was a politician. Some gladiators knew how to work the crowd. These were the performers, the seasoned veterans, the ones who understood that survival came not just from skill, but from charisma. Others were less lucky, unknowns, recruits. The mercy granted by the crowd was not always altruistic. In some cases, mercy was almost guaranteed, but mercy was never certain. There were days when the mood was bloodthirsty. This power to cheer for mercy, to chant for death, was intoxicating. It gave the people a sense of control in a society where most had very little. Not all fighters welcomed mercy. Some, proud or shamed, refused to beg. They would not raise a finger. There were famous examples. The gladiator Flamma, known to have been offered his freedom multiple times by the crowd and editor. In time, this public mercy became ritual, a necessary part of the narrative. Every fight held the possibility. Even emperors played into this performance. Some, like Augustus, were known for granting mercy often, cultivating a sense of dignity and restraint. Over centuries, this dance between death and mercy defined the arena. It made the games more than execution, more than combat. And so, in the heat and dust, beneath marble arches and statues of gods, the gladiator waited. It was them. Amid the roar of the amphitheater, the rustle of thousands rising to their feet, and the pounding hearts of men still gripping blades in trembling hands, one figure alone held the weight of finality. Towering above the arena floor in the imperial box, framed by marble and guards, sat the emperor. Draped in imperial purple, crowned with laurels or a wreath, he gazed down upon the sand-stained circle below, not as a man watching a performance, but as a god deciding fate. The pollis verso, the turning of the thumb, was not merely a gesture. When a man fell to his knees and raised his finger, pleading for his life, all eyes turned to the emperor. He restored the games after decades of civil war, but he also set a tone of moderation. Trajan, for example, who presided over the empire at its greatest territorial extent, used the games to celebrate military victories, but also to exhibit discipline. He offered many gladiators the chance to earn their freedom through victory, and spared defeated fighters when the crowd approved. Under his reign, the games flourished, but were not uncontrolled slaughter. While he did not abolish executions or gladiator matches, he famously avoided unnecessary cruelty. Though better known for his stoic writings than blood sports, Marcus Aurelius still understood the importance of appearing at the games. He reportedly limited the number of lethal bouts and emphasized the ritual and entertainment aspects over pure killing. It inspired loyalty. It created stories. Gladiators spared by the emperor became legends. Their lives were bound, in public memory, to the mercy of the crown. If granted his freedom after several wins, he might retire. But if merely spared, he returned to the arena with a new legend and a new debt. That debt bound him to the emperor's story. It made him a tool of imperial myth. In turn, those gladiators became walking advertisements for imperial virtue. They would speak of how Caesar had spared them. It was not a mechanical reflex. It was a message. It said, "I see, I judge, I remember." To be spared by a referee or editor was survival, but to be spared by the emperor was glory. It might mean freedom. It might mean fame. Elevated above the arena, with full visibility and luxurious seating, it placed the emperor literally above life and death. When he stood alone. His gesture, no matter how small, could reverse fate. He was not just judge. He was the living bridge between mortals and gods. The stories of gladiators kissing the emperor's feet, swearing eternal loyalty, or dedicating victories to him filled Roman writings and graffiti. The gesture was more than symbolic. It was transformative. Sometimes mercy was a calculated performance. Sometimes it was sincere. Sometimes it was withheld for a lesson. But always it was remembered. How his gaze had saved them. How they owed him everything. And in a world built on perception, that was priceless. In sparing gladiators, he displayed the stoic ideal of measured rule, a ruler, governed not by impulse, but reason. A wise emperor, or the editor of the games acting on the emperor's behalf, would often choose to spare a popular or talented gladiator, not because of sentiment, but because he might draw crowds again. Even in decline, the Roman people remembered the arena not only as a place of violence, but as a place where justice, mercy, and power collided in the most visible, dramatic way possible. Life had value, not just moral, but monetary. His involvement in the arena served to underscore Rome's stability under his rule. A man spared at Augustus' hand was spared not just by the emperor, but by Roman civilization itself. Imagine it. A man lies bleeding in the sand. The fight is over. The crowd is hushed. And then Caesar rises, slowly, deliberately. He raises his arm. All eyes follow. The thumb tilts not down, but to the side or tucked into a fist. The man in the sand lives. The crowd erupts. They cheer not just for the spared fighter, but for the wisdom of Rome, the balance of justice and strength. It is, in a way, the perfect drama. Sometimes he consulted the crowd out of deference or performance. Sometimes he made the call alone. And when he signaled that the man should live, the decision resounded as a public expression of clemency, generosity, and controlled power. To deny the crowd its blood could provoke unrest. The people came for excitement, for catharsis. A fine balance had to be maintained, and emperors knew this. They read the mood. They felt the crowd's pulse. And in the pivotal moment, they chose not only for the man below, but for their own image. He was not a tyrant, the gesture said. He was Caesar. Just, fair, wise. It was an act of ultimate dominion. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, stands out as a brutal example. The difference was in intention. Where Augustus or Hadrian used the thumb as a symbol of civilization, Commodus wielded it like a child with a toy sword. He fancied himself a gladiator, descending into the arena to fight, not against skilled opponents, but animals or crippled men. His thumb was less a symbol of divine judgment and more a narcissist's tool. He killed for spectacle. He spared to amuse himself. His reign was not marked by mercy, but by excess. And yet, even with such terrifying authority, the emperor's thumb did not always point to death. In Rome, emperors were not just rulers, they were symbols. Their actions, public and ceremonial, rippled through society. The games were one of the most visible stages upon which they performed that symbolism. The Colosseum, a monument to Roman might and engineering, doubled as a theater of imperial power. When the emperor entered, the crowd erupted. His nod could silence tens of thousands. His raised hand, resting lightly on the balcony rail, was watched more closely than the blades below. It is easy to imagine emperors as cruel overlords, dispensing death at whim. And yes, some were. But many, perhaps most, understood that their role in the arena was not simply to appease their own appetites, but to play to the people, to uphold ideals, to display virtue. Mercy was one such virtue. And in the sand of the amphitheater, mercy was more than kindness. It was political theater. To grant missio, the release of a defeated gladiator, was a visible, dramatic act. Augustus, the first true emperor, cultivated an image of restraint. Later emperors inherited this tradition. Some followed it more faithfully than others. Then there were emperors like Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king. But mercy was not always consistent. There were emperors whose thumbs trembled not with compassion, but with ego. Still, even under emperors like Commodus, the ritual of judgment remained. The crowd still watched. The gesture still held power. But even the cruelest emperors understood one thing. Sparing a gladiator could be more useful than killing him. To pardon a defeated man, especially one who had fought bravely, was to show strength without cruelty. There was also a practical consideration. Gladiators were expensive. Well-trained, high-performing fighters could not easily be replaced. They were investments. Moreover, a man spared once had something to fight for. Publicly, mercy from the emperor could soften even the harshest spectacles. Yet this drama was not without risk. To spare too many fighters was to appear soft. This is why the emperor's thumb was so powerful. Gladiators, for their part, often hoped for imperial mercy more than any other. The imperial box itself was constructed to maximize this theater. As centuries passed and Christianity rose, attitudes toward the games changed. Some emperors curtailed the events altogether. But the imagery of the emperor's mercy endured, and at the center of it all was a single silent decision. A gesture made with no words, a flick of the hand, the turn of a thumb, the emperor's thumb. In the grand sweep of Roman civilization, its emperors and senators, generals and gods, there exists a quieter, rougher legend. That of the gladiator, who is not just a fighter, but a star. In an empire ruled by hierarchy and lineage, some of the most beloved figures were not born noble or free, but forged in blood and sand. They were slaves, prisoners, volunteers from the provinces, yet they stirred the hearts of Rome. It passed through word of mouth, through street songs, through carvings on tavern walls. Fans, yes, fans scratched their favorite fighters' names into wooden benches. They painted them onto pottery. They bought figurines at stalls near the Colosseum. His matches might be more frequent, but against less threatening opponents. The editors of the games wanted him to last. A popular fighter meant better ticket sales, fuller stands, louder crowds. In Rome, a commodity that pleased the masses was not wasted lightly. And those names, Flamma, Spiculus, Verus, and others grew. He had him richly rewarded lavish homes, servants, possibly even land. They were strength made flesh, courage embodied. Even women of high status fell under their spell. The lanista, the trainer and owner, might have legal rights over him, but he would think twice before sending a popular fighter into an unwinnable match. It was not given lightly. Only a fighter who had proven himself across many battles, and some, emboldened by their fame, entered other arenas, business, performance, even politics. Fame opened doors in Rome, even to those born into slavery. A once beloved champion who stumbled in a match could fall from grace. The crowd was fickle. They adored you until they didn't. The same voices that once cheered might turn. The same women who sent gifts might whisper cruel jokes. A hero today could be a disappointment tomorrow. And often who had won the favor of the people or a powerful patron could hope to receive it. Tombstones bear their stage names. Graffiti still visible on ancient walls testifies to their fans. Many bore scars they could never hide. They limped in old age. They lost eyes, fingers, teeth. It admired the strength of a lowborn, even as it kept them shackled. The gladiator who was cheered in the arena might still be beaten in the barracks. He might be adored by senators who would never dine with him. His face might appear on cups and vases, but he could not vote. He could not own property. He could not speak freely. Some fought with bones that never healed properly. Some died young, no matter how loved. But while they lived, they stood at the strange crossroads of brutality and admiration, and in some strange way more powerful than a man born to the Senate. They were not born powerful, but they became powerful. And in a society obsessed with strength and spectacle, that made all the difference. In many ways, they were the first true celebrities adored, commodified, sometimes destroyed by the weight of their image. Some saw taking down a famous opponent as the ultimate path to their own legend. Matches became personal. Reputation added a second layer to the fight. Not just survival, but status. Losing to a nobody could mean not just pain, but public humiliation. To be granted the Rudies was to walk out of the arena, not as property, but as a man. That man was an asset, and more than that, a public figure. If he died, it wasn't just a loss. It was a scandal. A life of obscurity in the barracks or fields, nameless and forgotten, was a slow death. But to stand in the center of the Colosseum, to hear your name roared by 40,000 voices, to fight and win and live, That was to taste immortality. Ancient graffiti from Pompeii reads, "Crescens, the net fighter, holds the hearts of the girls." Another scribble boasts, "Celadus the Thracian is the delight of all the girls." These weren't just inscriptions, they were declarations. If a crowd loved him, they would not tolerate his execution after a mere mistake or unlucky fall. When he raised his finger in surrender, they roared for mercy. When he limped from the sand, they cheered his survival. And if an editor or emperor tried to end his life unfairly, it could spark unrest. His body was no longer just his, it belonged to the people. Gladiators became heartthrobs, symbols of erotic danger, of masculine ideal. According to some accounts, Nero once declared that if he were to die, he wanted to die like Spiculus, gloriously, in the spotlight. Some lovers requested hairstyles, like the Ricciarius. Others wore tiny charms shaped like gladiator helmets. In a world where honor and glory were central, a man who faced death regularly and survived became a figure of intense fascination. It is a striking image, an emperor envying the death of a gladiator, but it reveals something deeper. These men, though of the lowest legal status, could rise to symbolic heights. They drew crowds. They inspired poetry. They sold oil flasks etched with their names. Gladiator matches were not unending slaughter. They were staged for drama. There were pairings of style and contrast, personalities and rivalries. And a man who understood that he was not just fighting, but performing, could win hearts as well as fights. He could become a public figure. They lived dangerous, brutal lives, but when they stepped into the arena, they were adored. Not all gladiators died unknown. Some became famous, and fame, in Rome, was everything. It began, often, with skill. A gladiator who survived more than a few matches began to stand out. A man who moved swiftly, fought cleanly, struck with precision, that man was noticed. And if he also had flair, if he saluted dramatically, or made eye contact with the crowd, or fought with a kind of reckless poetry, he was remembered. Word spread. A name began to circulate, first on the lips of fellow fighters, then among trainers, then, slowly, through the stone seats of the amphitheater. A name became a chant. A chant became a legend. There were no social media in ancient Rome, no printing presses or paparazzi. And yet, gladiator fame spread like wildfire. These men did not simply survive. They thrilled. They performed. Popularity brought rewards. A well-loved gladiator might be given better food, lighter duties, even more comfortable quarters in the ludus. Some gladiators were so beloved that even emperors took notice. The Emperor Nero famously favored a fighter named Spiculus. For many Romans, gladiators represented something powerful and primal. Their fame extended beyond the arena. They appeared in art, in poetry, in whispered gossip. For the gladiator himself, fame meant more than flattery. It meant leverage. A popular gladiator could not be discarded easily. This changed the balance of power. The more famous a gladiator became, the less disposable he was. In rare cases, a gladiator's fame was great enough to earn freedom. The wooden sword rudis was the symbol of liberation. Some retired, some taught, some remained close to the games, serving as referees or trainers. But fame had a price. The most popular fighters were also the most watched. Every movement scrutinized, every loss debated. And fame brought rivals. Other fighters wanted the spotlight. Some were jealous. Still, for many, the risk was worth it. Even centuries later, their names linger. Mosaic floors in wealthy Roman homes depict famous gladiators in frozen motion swords raised, helmets glinting. Their lives were not easy. The pain was real, the injuries permanent. Gladiator fame also exposed the contradictions of Roman society. Rome claimed to be a land of law and virtue, and yet it elevated slaves as heroes. And yet, He had something rare, something even emperors could not command. He had the love of the people. It is perhaps the most Roman of all paradoxes, that a slave with a sword could become more famous, more beloved. The gladiator, for all his chains, stood free in one way, in the hearts of those who watched him fight. For all the drama, showmanship, and discipline of the Roman arena, there were days when there would be no mercy, no staying hand, no imperial gesture, no crowd rising in a chorus of pardon. But death raw, deliberate, theatrical was always hovering. And though most trained gladiators were spared after a fair fight, there were exceptions. Sometimes, death was the point. The crowd knew it. The editor demanded it. The emperor expected it. And the condemned felt it from the moment they stepped onto the arena floor. There were days when the games were not games at all, but executions dressed as entertainment. Injured fighters might be sent into combat before healing, making death almost certain. The arena had its own politics, and those politics did not always favor survival. Days when a gladiator stepped into the sand not to test his skill or earn applause, but simply to die. These were rare, but terrifying. Fights held sine missione meant no surrender, no pardon. One man had to die. They cheered skill, applauded bravery, and spared those who fought nobly. But when tempers flared, when the match dragged or disappointed, or when vengeance filled the air, the mood could shift violently. The man in the sand collapses, and the crowd erupts. A series of fights had gone without a death. The audience grew restless. They needed blood, not metaphorically, but literally. They needed to see the sand darken, to feel the tension of life and death resolved in a single irreversible act. The crowd watched, not for suspense, but for spectacle. He might have been spared in previous matches, might have earned cheers, even a following, but the games were fickle. A single misstep, a wrong moment, or simply bad fortune could undo everything. The arena had no memory, only appetite. The outcome was clear from the start. The only question was how the death would come. Quickly? Honorably? Or dragged out for effect? Without it, the day felt incomplete. A roar not of joy, but of finality. Death has been served, and the show moves on. Some wept. Children saw it, two fathers raising them to witness the final breath of a man who, moments earlier, had been fighting for life. These deaths were real, and Rome, for all its glory, built its stories on the backs of the dying. If a fighter fell too easily, showed cowardice, or simply annoyed the audience, the response could be brutal. Christianity's rise brought new ethics, new discomfort with the arena's rituals. And when death came, it came quickly. A lunge, a cry, a silence. And then the next match. But for most of Rome's history, death in the arena was accepted. For some, it was a punishment, a final payment for past crimes. For others, it was betrayal. Trained, promised survival, only to be sacrificed for spectacle. And for a few, it was purpose. Death in the arena gave meaning to a life that might have otherwise been forgotten. Better to die before a roaring crowd than to waste away in a dungeon. Better to be remembered in death than to be erased in life. It was law. It was culture. It was the cost of the spectacle. Might see it in the way his opponent held his sword, the way the crowd leaned in, silent and expectant. Not just to the crowd, but to history. Each one was a thread in the tapestry of Rome's obsession with control over life, over bodies, over fate. Each corpse carried the echo of a civilization that demanded sacrifice to feel alive. But he would rise, fight as best he could, and meet death standing. These were the moments the crowd respected most. Not cowardice, not tears, but dignity in defeat. The final bow of a man who knew he would not leave the sand, but who refused to beg. Under Emperor Caligula, for instance, prisoners were reportedly forced to fight with dull weapons just to draw out their deaths, ensuring maximum agony. Others were left unclaimed, but even the anonymous deaths were not truly forgotten. The Colosseum walls, remember, the stones soaked in blood, the air still, perhaps, carrying faint echoes of that final cheer. Perhaps he'd fought well, but not dramatically. Perhaps he lost too quickly. Or perhaps, simply, it was his turn. It was a reminder to every Roman watching. Life was brief, glory was fleeting, and the empire itself was built not just on marble and law, but on the bones of the fallen. The arena, for all its ritual and rules, was still a machine that ran on blood. Nero, in his descent into madness, made games purely for cruelty's sake, staging elaborate deaths, killing for theatricality. In these instances, the arena was not an echo of war or discipline, but a mirror of tyranny. The victor steps back, the crowd waits. Then someone jeers. Another calls out. A chant begins not of life, but of death. Ugula! Ugula! They cry. Kill him. The editor hesitates. Looks to the emperor. The thumb is turned. Such contests were often decreed in moments of vengeance or glory. Others died mid-battle, caught by a well-placed thrust or downward strike. The blood soaked into the sand, often quickly. Slaves rushed in to drag the body away, rake the ground smooth, and prepare the stage for the next act. The crowd returned to laughter, food, betting. The moment passed. Perhaps a powerful patron had lost a son in war and demanded blood in tribute. Perhaps an emperor wanted to impress foreign guests with Rome's ruthlessness. Whatever the reason, when Sine Missione was declared, the rules shifted. A raised finger meant nothing. Only death would conclude the spectacle. The myth that every match ended in death is a modern exaggeration, born from lurid imaginations and blood-soaked cinema. A kind of moral cleansing. The man who had murdered, stolen, or rebelled now paid with his body. But there were always those among the audience who knew. Not every man in that sand had been truly guilty. Sometimes, death came not for justice, but for politics, fear, or convenience. There were many reasons a gladiator might be forced to die. Sometimes it was punishment. Not every man in the amphitheater was a trained fighter. Criminals, traitors, deserters, and rebellious slaves were frequently condemned ad ludum sent to the games either as low-tier fighters or, more grimly, as fodder. Their deaths were not hidden behind walls or quietly done at the edge of town. No, they were center stage. Noon performances often, when the sun was highest and the crowd needed a break between professional bouts. These men were stripped, sometimes dressed in humiliating costumes, and killed for spectacle. Sometimes by other gladiators, sometimes by animals, sometimes by elaborate traps and reenactments of mythological deaths made real. These were not men trained in the ludus, taught to use weapons or survive with honor. They were, essentially, condemned men, thrown to the arena for justice in its most performative form. The most brutal category of these was the naxi, those sentenced to execution by beast or blade. To the crowd, it was justice. Even trained gladiators could meet this end. A fighter who had displeased his lanista, broken rules, or shown defiance might find himself matched deliberately against a superior opponent. Then there were the Sine Missione games, those where no release was permitted. We have records of such events. But not all fatal matches were decreed so cynically. Sometimes the crowd demanded it. The Roman crowd was not always bloodthirsty. Imagine the moment. One gladiator falls, panting and bloodied, his sword knocked away. He raises a finger, asking for mercy. And in that moment, there is no appeal. The victor steps forward, raises his blade, strikes. It wasn't always about justice or performance. Sometimes it was about balance. And so, sometimes, a man was chosen if not officially, then by mood to die. There were execution-style killings dressed up as combat. One man clearly stronger, more skilled, more famous, facing a lesser opponent. To the dying gladiator, this was the end of the line. Still, some died with pride. A man might know he was outmatched. There were rituals for this. Some gladiators knelt, hands crossed behind the back, exposing their necks, inviting a clean kill. And yet, it lingered. Not every spectator was hardened. Some covered their eyes. There were protests, occasionally. Philosophers decried the games. Some citizens, particularly in later centuries, spoke against the bloodshed. Even those who condemned it couldn't always look away. What did it mean, then, to die in the arena? The arena did not discriminate. Slaves, soldiers, nobles fallen, from grace all met in the sand. And yet, in some small way, the deaths mattered. Some gladiators were buried with honor, their tombs marked with helmets or inscriptions. Because when death was the ending, it was not just for the man on the sand. To the roaring crowds of the Colosseum, the clash of steel, the spray of blood, and the thunderous fall of a gladiator to the sand may have seemed like pure chaos, a brutal and spontaneous collision of force and fate. But beneath the surface of these spectacles was something else entirely. They practiced with partners who became familiar with their style, their timing, their habits. Matches between seasoned gladiators were often staged with prior knowledge of who would fight whom. While not every bout was fully scripted, many followed a pattern. The idea was not to fake the fight, but to control it. Let the crowd see the style and weapons in motion. Then escalate. Move faster. Take more risks. Let one fighter seem to gain the upper hand. These men often faced each other multiple times. They knew each other's movements. One stumbles, the other presses. A near hit, a duck, a knee to the stomach. The opponent rolls, recovers, grins. It looks spontaneous. It looks dangerous. But many of these moments were planned. They were former gladiators themselves, men who knew the fine line between combat and carnage. They taught not just attack and defense, but theatrics. How to hold a pose after a strike. How to collapse in a way that looked real. The sand was raked between matches, not just to absorb blood, but to reset the stage. Every detail, from the colorful armor to the musical instruments that played during pauses, contributed to the idea that this was entertainment, not just execution. How to draw out the moment of surrender, arms wide, knee bent, head bowed, so the audience could savor the climax. Sometimes they even liked each other, and while they fought for real, there was often a mutual respect and a mutual interest in not dying needlessly. A poorly aimed strike, a man slipping in blood, a sudden surge of fear or anger. Real injuries happened, real deaths too, because while many fights were semi-staged, the weapons were real. The danger was not an illusion. Fighters who trusted too much in their performance might let down their guard and be caught fatally off script. A stab aimed for the shoulder might land with a shallow cut enough to bleed, to thrill the audience, but not enough to kill. The Retiarius, with his net and trident, moved like a dancer, baiting and retreating, creating tension. Every style brought its own rhythm, its own kind of choreographed danger. In the later empire, as Christianity spread and public appetite for blood waned, the games began to emphasize performance more and death less. The shift was subtle. Not a ban, but a tone change. And so, rehearsed violence became a form of art, almost a dance. It was still brutal, but it was controlled brutality. When two fighters from different schools faced off for the first time, some admired the artistry. Others criticized it as inauthentic. Seneca, the philosopher, lamented the game's descent into show over substance. Rehearsed, honed into a shape the public could consume. Gladiators, for all their suffering, were not disposable. They were trained, polished, displayed. They were dangerous and deliberate. But even he admitted the discipline of the fighters. They were not wild beasts. They were trained men. And in a world obsessed with order, that mattered. Their applause came in roars. And their legacy? It lives in the paradox they embodied. When a last-minute substitution occurred, when a prisoner or criminal was thrown in for a real kill. In those moments, everything changed. The performance gave way to survival. They fought with signature moves, poses, flair. Their battles became anticipated events, talked about for weeks. The public knew their styles. A quick upper slash, a dramatic leap, a flourish with the net. And so, these men learned to rehearse their identities. They were not just survivors. They were brands. And while some tried to keep the rhythm, many abandoned it, because in the end, no amount of choreography could fully tame the arena. A blow to the helmet might ring loudly, dropping a man to the sand, but the fall was prepared, the impact absorbed. Then reverse it just briefly. It was like music. There were crescendos, pauses. He did not just win, he played the part of the winner. A defeated man knew to appeal dramatically, not just crouch in fear. The entire structure of the games taught them this. Fight, yes, but also entertain. Trainers watched, corrected, advised. Step back here, not forward. Angle the shield. Let him push you in this round. It wasn't ballet, but it wasn't chaos either. It was violence, refined, sudden bursts of action, and just as quickly restraint, precision, practice. A choreography as intricate as any stage play. Many appreciated skill over slaughter. They cheered clever footwork, applauded strategic feints, gasped at near misses. And when a fight was especially thrilling, they called for both men to be spared, chanting "Mit" to let them live. The performers, because that's what these gladiators were, knew how to feed that hunger, to fight in a way that made survival not just acceptable, but deserved. Because while gladiators did fight and did risk injury or death, many of their matches were not mindless brawls. The audience came not just for gore, but for drama, for a narrative. A good match was like a play. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. It needed reversals, surprises, close calls. A dominant fighter who immediately struck down his opponent offered no suspense. But a contest that swayed back and forth, where each man seemed on the verge of victory, kept the crowd on edge. And the longer the crowd was engaged, the more impressed they were. This is what trainers and fighters learned to create. They were calculated performances, shaped by months of rehearsal, designed to thrill, but also to protect. To survive the arena, a gladiator had to be more than strong. He had to be skilled in the art of rehearsed violence. Gladiators were not simply thrown into the arena with weapons and told to improvise. From the day they entered the Ludus, the training school, they were drilled relentlessly, not just in combat, but in presentation. They learned how to fall safely, how to draw blood without causing lethal damage, how to parry in ways that looked dramatic but minimized risk. They trained like dancers and athletes, repeating movements over and over until their bodies moved with instinctive grace. Their weapons in training were wooden or blunted, but the forms were real. And that was the point. Control. A chaotic, bloody battle that ended in death after mere seconds was bad for business. Many of these battles had an unspoken rhythm, open with measured strikes, because behind the performance was a shared understanding. We both want to survive this. This was especially true among veteran gladiators, men who had fought multiple times, gained reputations, perhaps even fan followings. Imagine two fighters entering the arena. One raises his shield, the other twirls his trident. The crowd cheers. They clash, sparks fly from the blades. Not scripted, like lines in a play, but practiced. Like boxers who spar, knowing where the real pain lies, but holding back just enough. The trainers, or doctors, played a huge role in this, and the audience, for their part, expected it. Roman crowds were not as bloodthirsty as modern myths suggest. Even the arena itself was designed for spectacle. Still, this rehearsed violence was not without risk. Even the best planned fights could go wrong. A misstep. There were also matches where no rehearsal was possible. And yet, even in those cases, the culture of performance lingered. A victorious gladiator knew to pause, to raise his arms, to let the crowd react. In some cases, the best fighters were like celebrities, and celebrities didn't die quietly. Behind closed doors, in the training grounds, they practiced. They repeated duels. They discussed scenarios. Even weapons were tailored for effect. The curved blade of the Sika, favored by Thracians, allowed for dramatic slashes. Roman riders, too, were aware. Over time, some fights may have become more theatrical, especially as public attitudes shifted. And that's what makes it so fascinating. Because in a society that celebrated domination, that enslaved millions, that built monuments from conquest, there still existed this strange, sacred space where even violence was tamed. Their world was built on risk, but also repetition. On instinct, but also intention. They were not actors in the modern sense, but they performed. Their stage was sand. Their script was written in movement. They fought for real, but they fought as if life itself were theater. In the world of the Roman gladiator, death was not the stranger in the dark. It was the roommate across the hallway. In the barracks of the ludus, in the cold dormitories where straw mattresses lined the stone walls, men slept side by side, knowing that one day they might be ordered to fight each other to the death. And yet, among these men criminals, slaves, volunteers, prisoners of war, there grew something powerful and difficult to reconcile with the violence of their profession. Brotherhood. Forged in sweat, pain, fear, and blood, this camaraderie was perhaps the most human element in an inhuman world. Latin was the common tongue, but hand signals, nicknames, and shared silence often spoke louder. A man who could barely say your name might still hold you upright during a brutal session, or give you the last crust of his bread when your stomach growled at midnight. There was no room for pride or division. In the arena, the crowd saw individuals, but in the barracks, they were brothers. It made the job harder. It made survival sweeter, and it complicated everything. They became legends within their walls, older, scarred men whom the younger recruits both feared and revered. That the cheers of the crowd might demand one of you not walk away. It happened more often than anyone liked to speak of. A noble editor or a bloodthirsty emperor might demand it as proof of loyalty or simply for sport. And when that happened, something broke. The crowd screams for blood. Your friend looks at you, not with hatred, but with apology. The blade is heavy in your hand. You hesitate. He does not. And suddenly, you are the one looking up, not at an enemy, but at someone you once called brother. Then everything goes red. You needed someone to change your bandages, to help you sit upright when your ribs screamed. Gladiators often shared food, shared stories, shared memories of life before the sand. One had been a farmer, another a blacksmith. Two fighters agreed in advance how the match would unfold. They rehearsed it. They made it look real. One would fall dramatically at the right moment. The arena demanded truth, even when truth was cruelty. And yet, over and over, fighters chose their friendships over spectacle. They returned to the ludus as trainers, ensuring the next generation learned not just how to fight, but how to survive. One tombstone reads, "To my friend who fought beside me and died bravely." Another, "We trained together, ate together, bled together." These weren't just fighters. They were family. They shared their stories, honored the dead. Some even pooled their savings to build tombs for fallen comrades, memorials with inscriptions that spoke of courage, loyalty, and love. Chose not to kill a brother, even if it meant pain or death for themselves. The other would win, but without dealing a fatal blow. Gladiators adopted this word too. For them, the ludus was their tent, their world, and inside it, they were more than tools of entertainment. They were Cantabernale's brothers in arms. If they were lucky, the audience believed it. The lanista nodded, the editor signaled for mercy, and they both walked out alive. About laughing in the barracks the night before a match, about sharing a stolen apple, about holding a dying friend's hand while the crowd cheered. The arena tried to turn men into animals, but the bonds they formed proved otherwise. They died with honor, but more importantly, they lived with love. One had lost his wife and sold himself into the arena to feed his children. These weren't myths, they were men. And when those men cared for each other, their willingness to kill for applause grew complicated. Not just between the two fighters, but in the soul of everyone watching. They stood in the sand and dropped their weapons. Others fought weakly, clearly holding back. A few were beaten or punished for cowardice, had no place in the arena, at least in the eyes of the Roman elite. But to the fighters themselves, mercy was not weakness. It was a last grip on dignity. These veterans often became informal mentors. They showed you how to block more efficiently, how to fall without breaking your collarbone, how to clean a wound with less agony. Their rhythm was lost. Their hunger to win vanished. They still fought, still trained, still lived, but something had dimmed. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They had killed not to survive, but because they were told to. And worse, because the crowd had wanted it. Sparring slowed. Jokes died on the lips. A crowd who knew the fighters were from the same school might chant their names, rise to their feet, and cry out for both to be spared. Rome, for all its brutality, could be sentimental. Brotherhood in the ring, displayed openly, sometimes softened even the hardest audience. Everyone knew it was possible, but when the names were posted, the reality became unbearable. Sometimes the two men begged their lanista to reconsider. Sometimes they trained harder than ever, not to win, but to ensure the fight would be worth enough to earn a double pardon. They knew how to make it dramatic, drawn out, respectful. The hope was that the editor or the crowd would be so moved they would call for missio mercy. But they also taught you subtler things. How to read the crowd, when to bow, how to hold your sword so the sun caught the blade just right. These were not tricks for war, they were lessons in survival. For most gladiators, the ludus was not just a training ground. It was home. They arrived broken, captured in war, sentenced for crimes, sold by desperate families, or driven by the lure of glory and money. Hours upon hours of repetition. They trained with wooden weapons to preserve their bodies, but the force behind each blow was real. Pain was frequent, sometimes deliberate. Trainers demanded more than obedience. They demanded transformation. In this space of shared struggle, bonds formed. You helped bind a fellow trainee's sprained wrist, because tomorrow you might need his help when your ribs cracked. You whispered encouragement between drills. You celebrated when one of your group was praised. And when someone collapsed, you didn't laugh. You knew you could be next. Whatever the path, once inside the gates, all differences collapsed. Status, ethnicity, and past lives mattered little. What mattered was endurance. Strength, the ability to survive grueling drills, punishing routines, and the ever-present knowledge that they were being shaped into weapons. Alone, no man could survive the ludus. But together, the men created something else. A shield made not of bronze, but of trust. Morning routines began before sunrise. The clang of bells, the bark of orders. Stretching, running, lifting stones, sparring. Many gladiators came from foreign lands, Gauls, Thracians, Numidians, Germans. This bond deepened with time. Some fighters stayed in the ludus for years, surviving fight after fight. And yet, always lurking beneath the friendship was the knowledge that one day you might be asked to fight the man you shared bread with. When two men from the same ludus were matched against each other, the tension in the barracks changed. Meals grew quieter. And often, that's what happened. But not always. There are records of men ordered to fight to the death, regardless of affection. Imagine kneeling beside your best friend, both of you heaving from exhaustion, blood dripping from your arms, the sand sticky beneath your feet. These moments haunted those who survived them. Some gladiators, after such a fight, never returned to form. The camaraderie among fighters wasn't just sentiment. It was necessity. Injuries were frequent. Some gladiators refused to fight their brothers. There were also stories of quiet defiance. But they knew the risks. If discovered, they could be punished, even executed. Outside the arena, this bond continued. Retired gladiators, those who earned their rudies and became free men, often stayed connected. Archaeological findings support this. Inscriptions refer to comrades in arms, beloved brothers, partners in battle. The Romans had a word for this bond contubernium. Originally used to describe soldiers sharing a tent, it came to mean deep, unbreakable companionship. Their stories are not just about bloodshed. They are about loyalty in the face of terror. The clang of metal on metal, the flash of sunlight off a polished helmet, the hiss of a net cutting through the air. To the roaring crowds of the Roman amphitheaters, these were the sounds and sights that stirred excitement, not just because they signaled violence, but because they told a story. The games were carefully curated to offer variety, suspense, and drama. Audiences didn't come just to see people die. They came to see different styles, strategies, personalities. And weapons played a key role in that. Each gladiator type or armatura came with its own unique set of arms and armor chosen, not necessarily to create a fair fight, but to create an interesting one. He wore a broad-brimmed helmet with a tall crest and carried a small rectangular shield. He might be paired against a murmillo, who was bigger, slower, and wielded a heavier shield than Gladius. The Sika's shape was eye-catching, and its use required flare slashes from unexpected angles, lunges that exposed the body. Wooden swords for training were a given, but even in some live shows, props were used when full contact wasn't the goal. During mock naval battles, Naumachia fighters used blunted blades or theatrical projectiles. Some helmets had griffins, feathers, or intricate designs etched into the bronze, not because they made the fighter safer, but because they looked good. They caught the light. They helped the audience identify who was who, even from the upper tiers. During ceremonial games, exotic weapons might be brought in for show Persian-style axes, African spears, even chariots. It wasn't just about function, it was about presentation. The sound of a blade sliding from its scabbard, the shimmer of steel under the sun, all of it added to the experience. A mistake could mean death. A missed parry, a stumble, a helmet knocked loose, all could turn a performance into a funeral. And when two gladiators fought for real, the weapons became what they had always been, tools of war. No amount of planning could eliminate the danger. Some fighters even had custom grips or decorative patterns on their hilts. They were crafted not just to kill, but to display killing. The curve of a blade, the weight of a net, the shine of a helmet, these were symbols as much as tools. They told the crowd, here is a Thracian, here is a Murmillo, here is a fight worth watching. Cast in bronze, shaped by calloused hands, raised before thousands of eyes, they shimmered with meaning. They were the props in a drama where survival depended not just on strength, but on spectacle. Some were heavy, clumsy, hard to master. Others were light, tricky, beautiful in motion. All were chosen for how they would look on the sand. The arena wasn't just a place of death. It was a stage. The gladius, for example, was the hallmark of Roman infantry, and thus a symbol of order and discipline. To see it in the hands of a gladiator was to see Rome's military might translated into spectacle. They speak of a world where violence was sculpted into form, where a curved blade meant more than a slash, it meant style, where a helmet didn't just protect, it communicated. The trident, by contrast, evoked the sea Poseidon, unpredictability, the outsider. The crowd read these symbols, consciously or not, and they affected how they viewed each fighter. Each created its own dynamic. Would the fight be about dodging, deflecting, or overwhelming? Two Murmillos might offer a brute force slugfest. A Hoplomachus with his long spear might evoke the Greek phalanx and tactics of ancient war. A Retiarius slipping free from the grasp of a heavily armored foe turned the match into a dance. Tombstones of gladiators often depicted their favorite weapon-engraved tridents, swords, shields. Marcus Murmillo, who fought with honor. Titus Retiarius, beloved by the crowd. Their identity was bound to their arms, not just because they killed with them, but because they lived through them. The Romans didn't just cheer for fighters, they cheered for stories. And weapons told those stories in steel. A shallow cut across the arm was a crowd-pleaser visible blood, minimal harm. A shoulder wound that made the arm sag created suspense. Was the fighter weakening? Would he rally? And if the final blow came, a clean stab through the torso looked more heroic than a messy slash. Fighters, trained by their doctors, knew how to receive wounds, how to stagger back, how to gasp, how to make it believable. And that question mattered, not just to the fighters, but to the crowd. The thrill came from watching styles collide. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a visual statement. They curated their stables with diversity in mind. A good ludus didn't produce only one kind of fighter. It trained a whole cast. This made their gladiators more marketable. An organizer planning a big festival in Gaul or North Africa might want 3 types of matches. A Retiarius fight, a duel between heavy-armed Murmillos, and a flashy bout with exotic weapons. A lanista who could offer all 3 earned more, and kept his men alive longer by choosing the right matchups. The combination of weapons and armor was not about fairness. It was about staging. A light fighter with a curved blade was not meant to have the same advantages as a shield-bearing brute. Instead, each had a role to play, like actors cast in opposing parts. A gladiator's weapon was not chosen purely for its deadliness. The Sika was fast and aggressive. The gladius was compact and efficient, suited for tight engagements. And each pairing played into these rhythms in deliberate ways. The matches weren't scripted, but the dynamics were built to create drama-like pitting a fencer against a brawler. The Retiarius, or net fighter, was lightly armored, no helmet, no shield, bare-chested and quick on his feet. Organizers didn't just schedule gladiator versus gladiator. They scheduled styles. The program might begin with animal hunts, followed by executions, then transition into a sequence of matches. Retiarius versus Secutor, Murmillo versus Frex, Hoplomachus versus Provocator. Each pairing brought fresh weapons, fresh strategies, fresh visuals. It was like flipping through channels each fight, offering a new kind of entertainment. He carried a weighted net, a long trident, and a dagger. Against him stood the Secutor, the chaser, whose body was sheathed in heavy armor. A smooth, close-faced helmet designed to deflect the Retiarius's trident, a large curved shield, and a short stabbing sword called a gladius. It was a battle of contrast. Speed versus strength, agility versus power, minimal armor versus maximum protection. It was selected often deliberately for how it looked, how it moved, how it matched up against its opposite. It wasn't war. It was war made theatrical. And the weapons, like the fighters themselves, were as much about spectacle as they were about slaughter. Gladiator combat in Rome was never one-size-fits-all. Far from it. Take, for example, the classic matchup between the Retiarius and the Secutor. To the modern eye, the Retiarius might seem hopelessly under-equipped. But that was the point. The Romans loved an underdog. The crowd leaned forward as the Retiarius danced just out of reach, hurling his net, jabbing with his trident, trying to tire his slower opponent. The Secutor, sweating in his helmet, would press forward like a juggernaut, shrugging off attacks, waiting for his moment to close the gap and strike. The matchup wasn't balanced, it was theatrical. Other pairings followed similar principles. The Threx, or Thracian, was armed with a curved sword called a sica, designed to hook around shields and armor. Each weapon created a different rhythm of combat. The trident forced distance. The net introduced chaos and surprise. Beyond individual matches, the entire structure of the games emphasized variety in weaponry. The use of non-lethal or theatrical weapons also appeared in certain events. The Romans were connoisseurs of violence, but they were also connoisseurs of contrast. This attention to contrast extended to armor. The helmet of a Threx, for instance, had high crests and a faceplate molded into dramatic shapes. Shields, too, were not uniform. The scutum, a rectangular Roman shield, allowed for pushing tactics. The parmula, a smaller shield, demanded agility. The lanistae, those who owned and trained gladiators, understood this perfectly. Weapon maintenance was also part of the performance. Swords were polished, spears were balanced, armor was fitted precisely. Even the wounds inflicted were part of the drama. Yet despite all this showmanship, the weapons were still deadly. This tension between performance and peril is what made the weapons so fascinating. Weapons also carried reputations. In many ways, the weapons defined the narrative of the fight. Archaeology has uncovered many of these tools, some rusted and plain, others gilded or inlaid. Even in death, the weapons left their mark. And so, the weapons of the arena were more than instruments of death. They were characters in their own right. Because in the end, the gladiatorial games were not a battlefield. They were a performance. And the weapons? To the bloodthirsty imagination of modern pop culture, the life of a Roman gladiator is often boiled down to a single truth: fight, kill, die. A blaze of violence and spectacle followed swiftly by death in the sand. But the reality was far more complex. The arena, for all its savagery, was also a place of calculation, of business, of careers, and of unexpected longevity. In fact, the most successful among them fought dozens of times over the span of years. Their names became known, their styles recognized. Their scars, their victories, even their defeats, were spoken of with awe by crowds who followed their careers the way modern audiences might track a boxer or a footballer. In short, a gladiator could have a career, not just a death sentence. For many gladiators, survival wasn't just a hope, it was a goal. A smart gladiator learned how to fight effectively and safely. They came for drama, yes, but they also appreciated skill, style, bravery. A fighter who defended well, who showed courage and grace under pressure, might win over the crowd even in defeat. A single finger raised by the editor could spare him, and if he survived, he lived to fight another day and to build his reputation further. He studied his opponents, read the mood of the crowd, calculated risks. He knew when to go for a dramatic flourish and when to hold back. He might receive gifts, fanfare, and the rarest of rewards. A rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. Blades slipped. A misstep, a stumble, a blow too heavy death could come even in a fight meant to end mercifully. But gladiators learned to reduce these risks. Training emphasized not just attack, but control. Defensive stances, feints, dodging, and when mercy was offered, taking it gracefully, a groveling gesture. An outstretched hand, a visible wound could win over the crowd and the editor alike. Facing death regularly, losing friends, recovering from injuries. These wore on the spirit, wrapping a piece of cloth from a fallen comrade around their arm. Superstition and habit became armor. And when the gate opened and the crowd roared, they stepped forward not as doomed men, but as performers ready to seize another day. Gladiators who lasted long didn't just survive the fights. They survived the life, the noise, the expectations, the mental toll, injury, bad luck, a cruel opponent, a harsh editor. Which editor was merciful? Which audience favored flamboyant styles? When to make a match look close, when to finish quickly. They became not just warriors, but strategists. The early fights were the most dangerous. Green recruits, overeager or poorly trained, often died quickly. Not long by modern standards, but long enough to become known, respected, even loved. One wrong move, and a promising career ended in a pool of blood. But walk the rope carefully, and you could live to see yourself painted on a tavern wall, your victories scrawled in red ochre for all to see. Those who lasted 3 or 4 matches increased their odds dramatically. With each fight, they learned. They adjusted. They earned mercy more often. Their fame lingered, giving them a social currency rare among former slaves. A few joined traveling exhibitions, fighting in staged bouts for rural festivals. Lucius, who fought 12 times and won 10, freed by the crowd, beloved by all. Decimus, slayer of 30, merciful in victory, honored in death. These were not anonymous victims. These were men who, against all odds, turned their captivity into legacy. They'd reenact famous matches, show off old scars, sell small trinkets. It wasn't glory like before, but it was a living. They learned to steel themselves before stepping into the sunlit sand, to block out the jeers and the drums, to focus even as a sword swung toward their throat. A fighter who earned his rudies didn't have to fight again. He could retire. But for those who played it well, it offered a kind of immortality, not just survival, but significance. They shared tips and tactics with their fellow fighters. They trained constantly, not to bulk up, but to refine their craft into stone, into memory. And perhaps most importantly, they had the will to endure. Inscriptions recorded their names and number of wins. Statues, mosaics, and graffiti told of matches won in style. Some gladiators achieved a level of celebrity almost unthinkable for slaves or criminals. Women threw flowers into the arena. Children copied their stances with wooden sticks in alleyways. Rich men paid to have dinner with them. Gladiators were symbols of masculinity, courage, endurance. They were both outcasts and icons. Some did. Others, surprisingly, chose to keep going. Fame had become addictive. Their experience made them respected, even feared. Younger men listened when they spoke. They had survived, and that survival made them wise. Or perhaps the world outside the arena, with its uncertainty and poverty, was less appealing than the structured life of the ludus, where food, shelter, and glory were guaranteed. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill, but to dominate. To make the editor or emperor sitting high above raise his hand and declare Missio Mercy. And for some, it was achieved not in spite of the arena's brutality, but because of it. Some records speak of fighters who reached 30 or even 40 bouts, a staggering number considering the risks. These weren't suicidally reckless men. They were professionals. They fought with calculation. They developed techniques that emphasized safety while still appearing dangerous. Some were known for winning by exhausting their opponents rather than killing them. Others mastered dramatic, but non-lethal moves, sweeping a foe's legs, disarming without stabbing, pinning instead of slicing. The truth, unglamorous and grounded, is that gladiators often did not die in every match. This was, in part, by design. Their goal wasn't to dispose of fighters quickly, but to train, promote, and profit from them. Training a gladiator was expensive. Food, medical care, instructors, housing, equipment all required money, and it was an investment. An untrained man thrown into the arena and killed was a financial loss. A trained fighter who could win, entertain, and survive. That was a valuable asset. The owners of the gladiator schools Laniste were businessmen. A good gladiator became a kind of brand. People remembered his name. They asked when he'd next fight. They bet on him. They bought souvenirs with his likeness. Promoters, those who organized games in towns across the empire, would request certain fighters by name, offering more money for appearances. And so, keeping a fighter alive made sense for everyone involved, except, perhaps, the man across from him in the sand. Fighters themselves knew this too. They didn't train to die. They trained to perform, to win, to impress. And mercy was common. Contrary to popular belief, Roman audiences didn't always thirst for blood. This was the long game. A gladiator who fought well and often could rise in status. And make no mistake, glory mattered. Rome admired its gladiators, even as it condemned them to violence. Murals depicted their victories. A career of 10 or 20 matches was not unusual. That said, the arena was never safe. Accidents happened. Career fighters also benefited from support systems. They had doctors, called medici, who specialized in treating arena wounds. Because longevity in the arena wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Fighting in front of thousands. Many developed rituals, touching the ground before a match, whispering prayers to gods old and new. Over time, some even transitioned into other roles. Retired fighters often became trainers' doctors, passing on techniques to new recruits. Others went into business. With the right connections, some ex-gladiators bought property, opened taverns, or even became minor officials. The path to longevity, however, wasn't open to all. Some fighters never made it past their first match. Survivors also learned to read the politics of the arena. And behind it all was always the tension, the tightrope between glory and death. Some historians suggest that the average lifespan of a gladiator once past the first. Few fights could stretch several years, in rare cases, even revered. Epitaphs found on tombstones of gladiators often speak of their triumphs and their journeys. The long game wasn't easy. It required discipline, intelligence, a tolerance for pain, and a knack for reading both enemies and crowds. To be remembered in Rome was rare. Most slaves, even most citizens, vanished into obscurity. But a successful gladiator could carve his name into history. And perhaps that, more than blood or gold, was the real prize. In the swirling dust and roar of the Roman amphitheater, amid the cries of tens of thousands of spectators, a rare and fascinating phenomenon unfolded. Certain gladiators became more than mere fighters. They became heroes. To the Romans, these men, often slaves, sometimes criminals, occasionally volunteers, were more than bloodied combatants. They were larger-than-life figures, symbols of courage, endurance, and a raw, captivating form of humanity. Rome was a civilization deeply rooted in the ideals of martial virtue. A single match might draw attention, but sustained fame required repeated displays of skill, bravery, and an ability to captivate the crowd's emotions. The crowd knew exactly what to expect when a famous Mirmillo or Ricciarius entered the arena. An anticipation built as the gladiators stepped forward, helmet gleaming and weapons poised. In this way, a gladiator's personality and reputation became inseparable from their style, creating a form of early celebrity branding. To the fans, these heroes were characters in an epic saga, each about another chapter in their unfolding story. Gladiators who consistently won battles, especially in dramatic or stylish fashion, became favorites. The Laniste, along with game organizers, understood that star gladiators were assets. They managed matchups to build suspense and maintain interest, sometimes arranging rematches to settle grudges or create new rivalries. Publicity surrounding these fighters was carefully orchestrated, blending fact with myth to amplify their legend. Fighters were expected to perform, to win, to live up to the legends crafted around them. They were slaves and yet celebrated, entertainers and yet warriors, victims and yet embodiments of Roman virtue. Tombstones and epitaphs bearing their names and achievements offer glimpses into lives that were at once brutal and heroic. Artistic depictions, from mosaics to graffiti, preserve their memory in vivid detail. Stories of famed gladiators echoed through centuries, inspiring literature, art, and popular culture far beyond Rome itself. Their lives and deaths encapsulated the empire's complex relationship with violence, power, and spectacle. In their battles, Romans saw not just bloodshed, but reflections of their own struggles, fears, and hopes. Gladiators became living metaphors for resilience in the face of adversity. Injury, illness, and political whims could swiftly end a career. The fickle nature of public favor meant that even the most beloved heroes could fall from grace. They were legends forged in blood and spectacle, icons of a culture that celebrated bravery and endurance amidst darkness. Their names, their stories, and their images continue to captivate us, reminding us that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit can rise and become immortal. Still, the chance to achieve glory, and sometimes even immortality through fame, was a powerful motivator, driving gladiators to risk everything again and again. This deliberate shaping of gladiator personas helped transform mere fighters into cultural icons, their stories woven into the social fabric of the empire. Roman amphitheaters were colossal venues, capable of seating tens of thousands, and gladiatorial contests were among the most popular forms of entertainment. Gladiators who showed unwavering courage in the face of overwhelming odds won a different kind of admiration. Even a defeated fighter could become a hero if he endured with dignity, refused to submit, or accepted his fate with stoic grace. The crowd, moved by such displays of bravery, might call for mercy, offering the defeated a second chance at life. When death came, it was often mourned with surprising solemnity. Funerals for fallen gladiators were sometimes large public affairs, complete with speeches and ceremonies that honored their sacrifice. In death, as in life, these men could achieve a status that transcended their origins. Merchants capitalized on this popularity, selling small trinkets and tokens emblazoned with the likenesses or symbols of the most famous fighters. While most gladiators were slaves or prisoners, some gained access to circles, usually closed to their class, through their celebrity. Wealthy patrons sought their company, offering gifts and favors. Some gladiators were granted freedom for their valor or popularity, receiving the coveted rudes, a wooden sword symbolizing their release from the arena. Freedmen often continued to fight by choice, motivated by the allure of fame, money, or simply the structure and identity the arena provided. For a select few, gladiatorial heroism became a pathway to a different life, however fraught. Signature moves, theatrical gestures, and even carefully staged rivalries added to their allure. A fighter who could entertain and inspire was far more valuable to Lannister, the owners and trainers of gladiators, than one who simply fought brutally. The more a gladiator could excite and captivate the crowd, the greater the chance of favorable treatment, more lucrative matchups, and importantly, survival. In the streets, children played mock battles, brandishing wooden swords and shouting the names of their heroes, mimicking their moves with wide-eyed enthusiasm. The passion for these men transcended class boundaries, bringing together slaves, citizens, soldiers, and aristocrats in shared admiration. From the city of Rome itself to provincial towns across the empire, games were held regularly, often tied to religious festivals or political events. The names of star gladiators traveled with the games, spreading their reputations like wildfire. Public announcements, graffiti, and even market chatter kept their fame alive. For many, following a gladiator's career was a form of sport in itself, with bets placed and allegiances formed. They were the ones whose names were whispered with reverence during breaks in the games, whose likenesses were etched into walls, and whose exploits were the subject of songs and poems. These men created narratives around themselves. The relentless warrior who never yielded, the cunning tactician who outwitted his foes, or the charismatic showman who entertained even in defeat. Courage, discipline, and endurance were the cornerstones of what it meant to be a Roman citizen, though these virtues were often idealized far beyond the reach of most. Yet in the gladiatorial arena, these ideals were brought starkly to life. Here was a place where even those born into chains could win admiration by demonstrating fearless resolve in the face of mortal danger. Gladiators embodied these virtues in their flesh and blood, creating a paradoxical figure who was both despised as a slave and adored as a hero. Their names echoed from the marble seats to the bustling forums of Rome. Their images adorned oil lamps and frescoes, and their stories were told in taverns and marketplaces far beyond the city. These were gladiators who transcended the brutal reality of their existence and entered the realm of legend. To understand how gladiators could become heroes, one must first grasp the nature of Roman society and its values. Becoming a hero in the arena was no accident. It was a process that unfolded gradually, fight by fight. Some gladiators came to embody entire fighting styles, their names synonymous with particular weapons or tactics. This widespread fame was fueled by the visibility and frequency of the games themselves. The devotion of gladiator fans was remarkable. Wealthy admirers sometimes commissioned portraits, statues, or oil lamps depicting their favorites. Gladiators themselves were not oblivious to their growing celebrity. Many cultivated their personas with care, understanding that fame was as much a tool as any weapon. Behind this cultivation of image was a sophisticated system of marketing and promotion. Remarkably, heroism in the arena was not always tied to victory. The social impact of gladiatorial fame was profound. Yet the life of a celebrated gladiator was never without danger or uncertainty. The fame that brought adulation also brought pressure. At a symbolic level, these heroes represented the tensions and contradictions of Roman society. Their legacy endured long after the last sands of the arena were swept clean. In the end, the heroes of the arena were not merely fighters. In the grand spectacle of ancient Rome, gladiatorial games were never just about combat or entertainment. They were a potent tool of political theater, an arena not only for swords and shields, but for the subtle, often ruthless, exercise of power. From the halls of the Senate to the imperial throne itself, gladiatorial contests served as a stage upon which leaders projected strength, magnanimity, and control. By providing lavish spectacles free to the public, they won goodwill and admiration. On one level, they served as a form of public relations. For them, gladiatorial contests were opportunities to display their power and cultivate an image of generosity and justice. The emperor's thumb, the infamous pollis verso, became a tool to project a merciful yet authoritative image. Sparing a gladiator in front of thousands created a spectacle of compassion and strength combined, reinforcing the idea that the emperor was a just ruler. It also served to heighten drama, making the crowd more invested in the outcome. By sponsoring lavish contests, emperors could curry favor with powerful senators and wealthy citizens, integrating them into a spectacle that affirmed their status and loyalty. At the same time, the spectacle served as a reminder of the emperor's ultimate authority, a display that no political faction could easily challenge. The games thus became a tool to maintain political stability and hierarchy. The tension between death and mercy underscored the emperor's role as ultimate arbiter. Excessive bloodshed or perceived cruelty could alienate spectators, undermining the very authority the games were meant to reinforce. Balancing entertainment with political messaging required skill and sensitivity. Emperors who failed to read the mood risked losing popular support. Their reactions, cheers, and boos were not only responses to the fighters, but signals to those in power. The arena was a place where death and mercy were carefully choreographed to serve the ambitions of rulers, where heroes and villains were cast to reinforce social order, and where the will of the emperor was made visible to thousands. The spectacle of blood and bravery was inseparable from the exercise of political power, a vivid reminder that in Rome, even violence was political. Politicians and emperors monitored the mood of the masses carefully, using the games to gauge public sentiment. They were not merely brutal entertainments, but intricate rituals of power, designed to keep an empire united under the watchful eyes of its rulers. And in the sand and sweat of the arena, the fate of men became a message to all power could be won, displayed and mercifully granted, but it was never to be questioned. An unruly crowd could be both a threat and a resource. Managing it through spectacle was a delicate balancing act. The games were, in effect, a form of political communication, a way for rulers to speak directly to the people without words, using action and spectacle. The emperor's presence at the games was a public affirmation of his role as protector and provider. Star fighters were sometimes favored or protected because their popularity served political ends. The success of these gladiators boosted the appeal of their patrons, creating a symbiotic relationship between fighter and politician. Conversely, gladiators who became too independent or problematic could be quietly removed or forced into dangerous matches. The arena was not only a place of contest, but also a stage for the political ambitions of those who controlled it. When an emperor granted mercy to a fallen gladiator, raising a thumb to spare his life, it was a dramatic gesture loaded with political symbolism. Events were often scheduled to coincide with important political occasions: the emperor's birthday, military victories, or the inauguration of public buildings. The scale and grandeur of the games reflected the importance of the occasion and the ruler as desire to impress. Sometimes, the sheer extravagance of the spectacle was meant to overshadow political unrest or economic hardship, diverting attention from problems with dazzling displays of power. It showed not only clemency but control. The emperor held the power of life and death, and his decision was final. A magistrate might stage grand spectacles to impress voters or allies, showing off wealth and organizational skill. These events also functioned as social control, reinforcing the emperor or politician as benevolent authority by giving the people a sense of inclusion and entertainment. Gladiators who were spared could become symbols of hope and resilience. Their survival was a reminder that even in the harsh world of Rome, justice and mercy existed under the emperor's watchful eye. This helped soothe tensions among the populace, many of whom lived under harsh conditions themselves. The games became a microcosm of imperial order, punishment and power balanced by clemency and control. The crowd's cheers were not merely for the gladiators, but for the patron who made the day possible. Triumphant generals and emperors commissioned games to mark their success, often incorporating exotic animals, elaborate sets, and reenactments of battles. These spectacles linked the gladiators' courage and sacrifice to Rome's martial glory, aligning the emperor's image with that of a victorious warrior king. The message was clear. The emperor was the embodiment of Rome's strength and the guarantor of its peace. The phrase panem et circenses spread, and circuses aptly described the strategy: feed the people and entertain them, and their demands for political change would often diminish. Gladiator games distracted and delighted, but they also reinforced social order by showcasing the power of the elite to control both life and death. Through carefully orchestrated shows, rulers harnessed the visceral appeal of the games to influence public opinion, secure loyalty, and solidify their rule. Understanding this political dimension reveals a crucial truth. The games were as much about spectacle and propaganda as they were about death and survival. The origins of gladiatorial games trace back to funeral rites and religious festivals, where combat was initially performed as a tribute to the dead. Over time, these contests evolved into public spectacles that enthralled the masses. By the late Republic and throughout the Empire, they had become elaborate events with political undercurrents that were impossible to ignore. Wealthy magistrates, senators, and emperors understood the power of the games to sway crowds and express authority. Hosting games was a way to demonstrate generosity, gain popularity, and signal political dominance. For many politicians, especially those seeking election or favor, sponsoring gladiatorial games was an investment in their careers. The political use of games was multifaceted. Imperial rulers, especially emperors, wielded the games with even greater strategic finesse. This gesture of mercy was far from arbitrary. It was often staged or influenced by political calculation. Staged mercy also played a part in maintaining social cohesion. Beyond the arena, gladiatorial games were used to celebrate military victories and imperial achievements. The political use of games also extended to managing rivalries and dissent within the elite. The crowds themselves played an important role in this political drama. The political nature of the games also shaped how gladiators were presented and treated. This intertwining of politics and spectacle was also evident in the staging and timing of games. However, this political exploitation was not without risks. Overuse or mismanagement of games could backfire, draining public funds and fostering cynicism among the populace. Ultimately, gladiatorial games were a powerful form of political theater that shaped how power was exercised and perceived in ancient Rome. In this way, the gladiator games reflected the heart of Roman politics, a blend of spectacle, control, and performance. The image of the gladiator fight in popular imagination is often one of relentless, brutal violence where combatants clash with lethal intent, and every bout ends with the death of at least one fighter. This vision is deeply ingrained in modern culture, shaped by countless movies, television shows, novels, and video games. Gladiators were expensive investments, trained at great cost and carefully managed by their lanistae. Their survival was not just a matter of fortune, but of financial and social necessity. Combat was fierce but regulated, with rules and referees ensuring fairness and safety where possible. Gladiators were often slaves or prisoners, but they were also valuable property. Some gladiators gained celebrity status, fighting dozens or even hundreds of matches in their careers. The prolonged careers of these fighters would have been impossible if death or severe injury was the typical outcome. Their owners, whether private lanistae or the state, had a vested interest in preserving them. These findings reveal a world where gladiators were trained athletes, respected performers, and in some cases, reluctant celebrities, not merely cannon fodder in a relentless bloodbath. The rituals, the public judgments, and the dramatic gestures all contributed to a spectacle that was about control as much as chaos. The myth of the kill perpetuated by movies, literature, and popular imagination oversimplifies a far more intricate reality. The true story of gladiators involves skill, strategy, showmanship, and survival as much as violence. By understanding this, we gain a richer appreciation of these ancient fighters and the society that both glorified and controlled them. The editor's decisions, including whether to spare a defeated gladiator, were significant moments charged with political and social meaning. The crowd's role in these moments was pivotal. Their reactions could sway life or death. This interplay added layers of tension and drama that went beyond simple slaughter. A skilled gladiator could earn fame, wealth, and freedom, which benefited both the fighter and the owner. The careful maintenance of gladiator schools and their strict discipline further supports the idea that gladiators were assets, not expendable commodities. Fighters learned to read their opponents, balancing aggression with caution, seeking the crowd's favor not through sheer bloodshed, but through skill, showmanship, and courage. The fight was as much a performance as a battle, designed to thrill without necessarily ending in death. A gladiator killed in every match would be an unprofitable one. Blood sport captures primal emotions and creates clear stakes for storytelling. Yet this emphasis distorts the realities of gladiatorial combat and the society that produced it. It reduces a rich, complex cultural phenomenon to a simplistic tale of savagery. Therefore, while death did occur, it was far from the default outcome. The roaring crowds, the raised thumbs signaling death or mercy, the dramatic final blows, these elements create a powerful, iconic picture of the Roman arena. Instead, the contests often concluded when one fighter yielded or was clearly defeated, signaling a surrender. The defeated gladiator might receive a reprieve from the editor, the official who presided over the games, often swayed by crowd reaction. Gladiators were skilled professionals who valued their lives, and yielding was sometimes a strategic choice, an admission of defeat, but a preservation of life. Yet beneath this familiar narrative lies a more complex and surprising truth. Gladiators did not always, or even usually, fight to the death. This myth of constant lethal combat is a product of centuries of storytelling, beginning long after the fall of the Roman Empire. Hollywood, for example, has played a massive role in cementing this image. Films like Gladiator and Spartacus brought the arena to vivid life for modern audiences, using the brutal spectacle of death as a key dramatic device. These movies, while thrilling and visually arresting, often blur historical accuracy in favor of emotional impact. The crowd's thirst for blood is emphasized, the inevitability of death dramatized, and the hero's survival framed as a narrow escape against the odds. In reality, the historical record suggests a more nuanced reality. Ancient texts, inscriptions, and accounts by historians like Tacitus and Suetonius indicate that most fights ended without death. This dynamic created a complex code of conduct in the arena. The myth of endless killing also ignores the broader social and economic context. Moreover, historical evidence points to instances where gladiators were given opportunities to recover and fight again, sometimes over many years. Modern pop culture also tends to overlook the ceremonial and symbolic aspects of gladiator combat. The persistence of the death-focused narrative in popular media may also reflect deeper human fascinations with violence and mortality. Historians and archaeologists continue to challenge these myths, using evidence from ancient texts, medical examinations of gladiator remains, and newly discovered inscriptions. In conclusion, while death was certainly part of the gladiator's world, it was not the defining or constant feature. The life of a gladiator was often portrayed as one of endless combat and peril, locked forever in the unforgiving arena. Yet for some, the brutal path of the gladiator did not end in death or despair. To receive this wooden sword was to be declared free, not only physically released from the constraints of the arena, but socially elevated from the status of slave or prisoner to that of a free man. However, the editor's choice was often influenced by the crowd, whose cheers and appeals could sway judgments. While it meant release from the rigors and dangers of the arena, it did not guarantee a comfortable life afterward. Freedmen often faced challenges reintegrating into society. Some returned to their places of origin, though many had no family or property waiting for them. The skills they had honed in combat were not easily transferable to civilian life, and former gladiators sometimes struggled to find new livelihoods. If the people demanded mercy or honored a gladiator's valor, the editor might respond by bestowing freedom. Their names appeared on tombstones and monuments, inscribed with honors and accolades celebrating their courage and accomplishments. This narrative resonated in a society fascinated by power, status, and redemption. The arena was a place of peril, where injury, illness, and politics could end careers abruptly. Their struggles, victories, and ultimate fates were woven into the fabric of Roman life, reflecting broader themes of power, survival, and identity. The wooden sword was not merely a tool of war, but a symbol of possibility, a chance to rewrite a life shaped by chains. Even those who survived multiple fights faced uncertain futures. The dream of the Rudies of retirement and release was a rare beacon in a life dominated by danger and control. Gladiators who earned their freedom embodied hope and resilience, showing that even the most marginalized could achieve recognition and respect. These memorials served as public reminders of their journey from the arena's brutal sand to the dignity of freedom. The Rudies was a key to freedom and a complex social statement. It represented not only survival, but triumph over the harshest conditions, a rare achievement in the brutal world of the arena. Through their retirement, gladiators challenged and reshaped their destinies, leaving a legacy of resilience and hope that echoes through history. Such inscriptions were rare, but they highlight the profound impact a successful gladiator could have both in life and death. Certain freed gladiators capitalized on their fame, leveraging their celebrity status to gain wealth and influence. Some became trainers themselves, running gladiatorial schools and passing on their expertise to a new generation. Others worked as bodyguards or soldiers, occupations that valued their combat skills and physical prowess. A few even entered the ranks of local militia or civil service, using their reputation and discipline to carve out respected roles. This dynamic underscored the gladiators' relationship not just with their masters, but with the audience, highlighting the performative nature of the games. Roman law recognized the Rudies as a formal instrument of manumission, conferring legal freedom. While the Rudies symbolized emancipation, the freedman's life was shaped by constraints and expectations. Gladiators who had gained freedom had to navigate a complex web of social relationships, often relying on patronage from wealthy citizens who appreciated their fame or skills. This reliance created new dependencies, even as old chains were broken. This process was a significant social transformation, shifting a gladiator's status from property to personhood. Yet freed gladiators remained distinct in society, often viewed with suspicion or fascination. Their past as entertainers and slaves marked them, and social mobility was limited. The stigma attached to gladiators lingered even as they gained freedom. The ritual of granting the Rudies was solemn, often accompanied by public ceremonies that celebrated the gladiators' achievements and bravery. This wooden sword became a badge of distinction, worn proudly by those who had earned it, a testament to their skill, endurance, and survival against overwhelming odds. A number of fighters, through skill, perseverance, and fortune, earned the chance to lay down their weapons and leave the sand behind. Their reward was a symbol of freedom, the Rudies, a wooden sword that marked their retirement from the gladiatorial life and the beginning of a new chapter. This transition, however, was far from simple or guaranteed. It was laden with challenges, hopes, and the complex realities of a society that both revered and exploited these warriors. The Rudies was more than just a token. It was a powerful emblem of emancipation and honor. Earning the Rudies was no small feat. It required exceptional performance over many fights, winning not only battles, but the respect of Lannister, editors, and the crowd. Gladiators had to prove they were not only fierce, but disciplined, consistent, and entertaining. Their victories had to be more than mere survival. They needed to captivate and command loyalty from the public. Only then would they be considered worthy of retirement, a rare and prestigious honor. The decision to grant a Rudies was ultimately in the hands of the editor, the official who presided over the games and held the power of life and death. For many gladiators, freedom was a double-edged sword. However, for some, retirement opened doors to new opportunities. The journey from slave fighter to free citizen was also shaped by legal and social structures. The paradox of gladiator freedom was a reflection of Rome itself, a society that prized liberty but was deeply hierarchical and stratified. For some retired gladiators, the legacy they left was one of enduring respect. The cultural significance of the Rudies extended beyond the individual. It symbolized the possibility of transformation, of rising from degradation to dignity. Yet, the reality for most gladiators was harsher. Many never reached the moment of freedom. This tension between aspiration and reality added depth to the gladiator's story. In some, when gladiators retired, it marked a profound transition. When the crowds had dispersed and the sands of the arena were swept clean, the echoes of gladiators' footsteps did not vanish entirely. Instead, their presence lingered not just in the stories told or the legends whispered, but etched forever in stone, ink, and the very fabric of ancient cities. Tombstones, graffiti, inscriptions, and ancient records form a mosaic of evidence that allows us a rare glimpse into the lives of these men, their struggles, triumphs, fears, and resilience. They often emphasized qualities like courage, endurance, and honor, virtues that transcended their origins as slaves or prisoners. Some tombstones record the number of victories, the weapons used, and even the number of times the gladiator had been spared death by the editor's mercy. These casual inscriptions suggest that gladiator games were a focal point of communal life, bonding people from all walks of society in shared excitement. The walls become a sort of ancient social media, where public opinion and popular culture were expressed in simple yet enduring marks. The excavation of gladiator cemeteries has revealed physical evidence of injuries, medical treatments, and even evidence of gladiator diets and training regimens. These findings show that gladiators were not mere disposable fighters, but carefully managed athletes. Friends, lovers, and fellow fighters sometimes dedicated monuments to one another, acknowledging shared experiences and sacrifices. They provide an anchor for our imagination and scholarship, allowing us to reconstruct a fuller picture of gladiators as individuals, shaped by their harsh realities, yet striving for dignity and honor. It reminds us that behind the myth of the bloodthirsty fighter was a human story of survival, fame, fear, and courage won, carved as indelibly into stone as it was into the hearts of those who watched and remembered. Each inscription, each etched name or crude drawing is a voice from the past speaking across millennia, refusing to be forgotten. These personal tributes provide poignant reminders that beneath the armor and spectacle were real relationships, friendships, loyalties, and losses that humanize the gladiators and their world. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss an upload. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you most about gladiator life? Drop a comment below and join the conversation. The bones tell stories of brutal training and harsh fights, but also of skilled care and resilience, reinforcing the complexity of their existence beyond the arena's blood and dust. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding of the skill, strategy, and politics behind the ancient games, beyond just the blood and spectacle. Gladiators were complex figures, often surviving many battles and becoming respected athletes and even celebrities of their time. Such details provide a rare, personal narrative amid the grand sweep of history, humanizing men who might otherwise be lost in the collective memory as mere entertainers or victims. Some inscriptions memorialize gladiators by their names, often Latinized, but sometimes revealing origins from across the empire, from Gaul to North Africa to the eastern provinces. This diversity highlights the wide-ranging backgrounds of those who found themselves in the arena, reflecting the vast and multicultural nature of the Roman world. Their stories, carved into stone, speak across time of human lives touched by fate and empire. Your support means a lot and helps keep these stories alive. Public monuments commissioned by emperors and wealthy patrons sometimes featured scenes of gladiators in action, immortalizing the spectacle and embedding it into the civic landscape. These artistic depictions, found on sarcophagi, mosaics, and frescoes, not only celebrate the spectacle, but also contribute to the myth-making of the gladiator. They depict idealized figures, strong, heroic, sometimes tragic, casting the gladiator as a symbol of Roman virtues. Through these enduring legacies carved in stone, the world remembers that gladiators were more than just fleeting figures of spectacle. They were real people whose lives shaped and reflected the Roman world. Tombstones and funerary monuments are among the most powerful sources of insight into the gladiator's world. Unlike the fleeting spectacle of combat, these memorials were designed to endure, offering testimony to a life lived and a death faced. Many gladiators, despite their low social status, were granted burials that defied expectations, complete with elaborate epitaphs praising their bravery and skill. The very act of carving a tombstone was a form of respect, an assertion that the life of a gladiator, often viewed with contempt or fascination, deserved recognition. These inscriptions reveal much about how gladiators saw themselves and how they wanted to be remembered. Graffiti offers another fascinating window into the daily lives and thoughts of gladiators and their admirers. Across the ruins of amphitheaters, walls, and public spaces, we find scrawled messages, drawings, and declarations, some praising particular fighters, others mocking rivals, or simply capturing the enthusiasm of fans. Unlike the formal language of inscriptions, graffiti was often raw, immediate, and personal. These scribbles reveal a vibrant culture of gladiator fandom, rivalries, and even humor, reminding us that the arena was not only a site of deadly combat, but also a social space where human emotions played out. In Pompeii, for example, graffiti survives that shouts the names of favored gladiators, bets placed on outcomes, and cheers for the bravest fighters. Beyond tombstones and graffiti, official records and reliefs commemorate gladiators and games, revealing their importance within Roman society. Archaeological discoveries have further enriched our understanding of gladiators' lives. The legacy left in stone also carries the echoes of personal stories. Moreover, the inscriptions and graffiti reveal the communal bonds formed around gladiators. Today, these legacies in stone continue to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the public alike. In the end, the legacy left in stone is a testament not only to the gladiators' endurance in the arena, but also to their lasting impact on history and culture. Thanks for watching this deep dive into why gladiators didn't always fight to the death. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating history content like this. For those who want to learn more, check out the playlist linked here, covering other intriguing topics about ancient Rome and its culture. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring history.